Chapter 15, Part 1 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South. The story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 15, Laying the Depots, Part 1. Mackintosh's account of the depot-laying journeys undertaken by his parties in the summer of 1915 to 1916 unfortunately is not available. The leader of the parties kept a diary, but he had the book with him when he was lost on the sea ice in the following winter. The narrative of the journeys has been compiled from the notes kept by Joyce, Richards, and other members of the parties, and I may say here that it is a record of dogged endeavour in the face of great difficulties and serious dangers. It is always easy to be wise after the event, and one may realize now that the use of the dogs, untrained and soft from shipboard inactivity, on the comparatively short journey undertaken immediately after the landing in 1915 was a mistake. The result was the loss of nearly all the dogs before the longer and more important journeys of 1915 to 1916 were undertaken. The men were sledging almost continuously during a period of 6 months. They suffered from frostbite, scurvy, snow blindness, and the utter weariness of overtaxed bodies. But they placed the depots in the required positions, and if the Weddell Sea party had been able to make the crossing of the Antarctic continent, the stores and fuel would have been waiting for us where we expected to find them. The position on October 9 was that the 9 men at Hut Point had with them the stores required for the depots and for their own maintenance throughout the summer. The remaining dogs were at Cape Evans with Gaze, who had a sore heel and had been replaced temporarily by Stevens in the sledging party. A small quantity of stores had been conveyed already to Safety Camp on the edge of the barrier beyond Hut Point. Mackintosh intended to form a large depot at Mina Bluff, 70 miles out from Hut Point. This would necessitate several trips with heavy loads. Then he would use the Bluff depot as a base for the journey to Mount Hope, at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, where the final depot was to be laid. The party left Hut Point on the morning of October 9, the 9 men hauling on one rope and trailing 3 loaded sledges. They reached Safety Camp in the early afternoon, and, after repacking the sledges with a load of about 2,000 pounds, they began the journey over the barrier. The pulling proved exceedingly heavy, and they camped at the end of half a mile. It was decided next day to separate the sledges, 3 men to haul each sledge. Mackintosh hoped that better progress could be made in this way. The distance for the day was only 4 miles, and the next day's journey was no better. Joyce mentions that he had never done harder pulling, the surface being soft, and the load amounting to 220 pounds per man. The new arrangement was not a success, owing to differences in hauling capacity and inequalities in the loading of the sledges, and on the morning of the 12th, Mackintosh, after consultation, decided to push forward with Wild and Spencer Smith, hauling 1 sledge and a relatively light load, and leave Joyce and the remaining 5 men to bring 2 sledges and the rest of the stores at their best pace. This arrangement was maintained on the later journeys. The temperatures were falling below -30° F at some hours, and, as the men perspired freely while hauling their heavy loads in the sun, they suffered a great deal of discomfort in the damp and freezing clothes at night. Joyce cut down his load on the 13th by depoting some rations and spare clothing, and made better progress. He was building snow cairns as guide-posts for use on the return journey. He mentions passing some large crevasses during succeeding days. Persistent headwinds with occasional drift made the conditions unpleasant and caused many frostbites. When the surface was hard and the pulling comparatively easy, the men slipped and fell continually, looking much like classical dancers. On the 20th, a northerly wind made possible the use of a sail, and Joyce's party made rapid progress. Jack sighted a bamboo pole during the afternoon, and Joyce found that marked a depot he had laid for my own farthest south party in 1908. He dug down in the hope of finding some stores, but the depot had been cleared. The party reached the Bluff depot on the evening of the 21st, and found that Mackintosh had been there on the 19th. Mackintosh had left 178 pounds of provisions, and Joyce left one sledge and 273 pounds of stores. The most interesting incident of the return journey was the discovery of a note left by Mr. Cherry Garrard for Captain Scott on March 19, 1912, only a few days before the latter perished at his camp further south. An upturned sledge at this point was found to mark a depot of dog biscuits and motor oil, laid by one of Captain Scott's parties. Joyce reached Safety Camp on the afternoon of the 27th, and after dumping all spare gear, pushed on to Hut Point in a blizzard. The sledges nearly went over a big drop at the edge of the barrier, and a few moments later Stevens dropped down a crevasse to the length of his harness. "Had a tough job getting him up, as we had no alpine rope and had to use harness," wrote Joyce. "Got over all right, and had a very hard pull against the wind and snow, my face getting frostbitten as I had to keep looking up to steer." We arrived at the hut about 7:30 p.m. after a very hard struggle. We found the captain and his party there. They had been in for 3 days. Gaze was also there with the dogs. We soon had a good feed and forgot our hard day's work. Mackintosh decided to make use of the dogs on the second journey to the Bluff Depot. He thought that with the aid of the dogs heavier loads might be hauled. This plan involved the dispatch of a party to Cape Evans to get dog pemmican. Mackintosh himself, with Wild and Spencer Smith, started south again on October 29. Their sledge overturned on the slope down to the sea ice, and the rim of their tent spread was broken. The damage did not appear serious, and the party soon disappeared round Cape Armitage. Joyce remained in charge at Hut Point, with instructions to get dog food from Cape Evans and make a start south as soon as possible. He sent Stevens, Hayward, and Cope to Cape Evans the next day, and busied himself with the repair of sledging gear. Cope, Hayward, and Gaze arrived back from Cape Evans on November 1, Stevens having stayed at the base. A blizzard delayed the start southward, and the party did not get away until November 5. The men pulled in harness with the 4 dogs, and, as the surface was soft and the loads on the 2 sledges were heavy, the advance was slow. The party covered 5 miles, 700 yards on the 6th, 4 miles, 300 yards on the 7th, 8 miles, 1,800 yards on the 9th, with the aid of a light northerly wind. They passed on the 9th a huge bergstrom, with a drop of about 70 feet from the flat surface of the barrier. Joyce thought that a big crevasse had caved in. "We took some photographs," wrote Joyce. "It is a really extraordinary fill-in of ice, with cliffs of blue ice about 70 feet high, and heavily crevassed, with overhanging snow curtains. One could easily walk over the edge coming from the north in thick weather." Another bergstrom, with crevassed ice around it, was encountered on the 11th. Joyce reached the Bluff Depot on the evening of the 14th and found that he could leave 624 pounds of provisions. Mackintosh had been there several days earlier and had left 188 pounds of stores. Joyce made Hut Point again on November 20 after an adventurous day. The surface was good in the morning and he pushed forward rapidly. About 10:30 a.m. the party encountered heavy pressure ice with crevasses and had many narrow escapes. After lunch we came on 4 crevasses quite suddenly. Jack fell through. We could not alter course, or else we should have been steering among them, so galloped right across. We were going so fast that the dogs that went through were jerked out. It came on very thick at 2 p.m. Every bit of land was obscured, and it was hard to steer. Decided to make for Hut Point, and arrived at 6:30 p.m. after doing 22 miles, a very good performance. I had a bad attack of snow blindness and had to use cocaine. Hayward also had a bad time. I was laid up and had to keep my eyes bandaged for 3 days. Hayward too. The 2 men were about again on November 24, and the party started on its 3rd journey to the Bluff on the 25th. Mackintosh was some distance ahead, but the 2 parties met on the 28th and had some discussions as to plans. Mackintosh was proceeding to the Bluff Depot with the intention of taking a load of stores to the depot placed on latitude 80 degrees south in the first season's sledging. Joyce, after depositing his 3rd load at the Bluff, would return to Hut Point for a 4th and last load, and the parties would then join forces for the journey southward to Mount Hope. Joyce left 729 pounds at the Bluff Depot on December 2, reached Hut Point on December 7, and after allowing dogs and men a good rest, he moved southward again on December 13. This proved to be the worst journey the party had made. The men had much trouble with crevasses, and they were held up by blizzards on December 16, 18, 19, 22, 23, 26, and 27. They spent Christmas Day struggling through soft snow against an icy wind and drift. The party reached the Bluff Depot on December 28, and found that Mackintosh, who had been much delayed by the bad weather, had gone south 2 days earlier on his way to the 80° south depot. He had not made much progress, and his camp was in sight. He had left instructions for Joyce to follow him. The Bluff Depot was now well stocked. Between 2,800 and 2,900 pounds of provisions had been dragged to the depot for the use of parties working to the south of this point. This quantity was in addition to stores placed there earlier in the year. Joyce left the Bluff Depot on December 29, and the parties were together 2 days later. Mackintosh handed Joyce instructions to proceed with his party to latitude 81° south and place a depot there. He was then to send 3 men back to Hut Point and proceed to latitude 82° south, where he would lay another depot. Then, if provisions permitted, he would push south as far as latitude 83°. Mackintosh himself was reinforcing the depot at latitude 80° south, and would then carry on southward. Apparently his instructions to Joyce were intended to guard against the contingency of the parties failing to meet. The dogs were hauling well, and though their number was small, they were of very great assistance. The parties were now 90 days out from Cape Evans, and all hands were feeling fit. The next incident of importance was the appearance of a defect in one of the 2 Primus lamps used by Joyce's party. The lamps had all seen service with one or another of Captain Scott's parties, and they had not been in first-class condition when the sledging commenced. The threatened failure of a lamp was a matter of grave moment, since a party could not travel without the means of melting snow and preparing hot food. If Joyce took a faulty lamp past the 80° south depot, his whole party might have to turn back at latitude 81° south, and this would imperil the success of the season's sledging. He decided, therefore, to send 3 men back from the 80° south depot, which he reached on January 6, 1916. Cope, Gaze, and Jack were the men to return. They took the defective Primus and a light load, and by dint of hard travelling, without the aid of dogs, they reached Cape Evans on January 16. Joyce, Richards, and Hayward went forward with a load of 1,280 pounds, comprising 12 weeks' sledging rations, dog food, and depot supplies, in addition to the sledging gear. They built cairns at short intervals as guides to the depots. Joyce was feeding the dogs well and giving them a hot hoosh every 3rd night. It is worth it for the wonderful amount of work they are doing. If we can keep them to 82° south, I can honestly say it is through their work we have got through. On January 8, Mackintosh joined Joyce, and from that point the parties, 6 men strong, went forward together. They marched in thick weather during January 10, 11, and 12, keeping the course by means of cairns, with a scrap of black cloth on top of each one. It was possible, by keeping the cairns in line behind the sledges and building new ones as old ones disappeared, to march on an approximately straight line. On the evening of the 12th they reached latitude 81° south, and built a large cairn for the depot. The stores left here were 3 weeks' rations for the ordinary sledging unit of 3 men. This quantity would provide 5 days' rations for 12 men, half for the use of the overland party, and half for the depot party on its return journey. The party moved southwards again on January 13 in bad weather. After a little consultation we decided to get under way, wrote Joyce. Although the weather is thick and snow is falling, it is worth while to make the effort. A little patience with the direction and the cairns, even if one has to put them up 200 yards apart, enables us to advance, and it seems that this weather will never break. We have cut up an old pair of trousers belonging to Richards to place on the sides of the cairns, so as to make them more prominent. It was really surprising to find how we got on in spite of the snow and the pie-crust surface. We did 5 miles 75 yards before lunch. The dogs are doing splendidly. I really don't know how we should manage if it were not for them. The distance for the day was 10 miles 720 yards, a splendid performance considering surface and weather. The weather cleared on the 14th, and the men were able to get bearings from the mountains to the westward. They advanced fairly rapidly during succeeding days, the daily distances being from 10 to 12 miles, and reached latitude 82 degrees south on the morning of January 18. The depot here, like the depot at 81 degrees south, contained 5 days' provisions for 12 men. Mackintosh was having trouble with the Primus lamp in his tent, and this made it inadvisable to divide the party again. It was decided, therefore, that all should proceed, and that the next and last depot should be placed on the base of Mount Hope, at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, in latitude 83 degrees 30 minutes south. The party proceeded at once and advanced 5 miles beyond the depot before camping on the evening of the 18th. The sledge loads were now comparatively light, and on the 19th the party covered 13 miles 700 yards. A new trouble was developing, for Spencer Smith was suffering from swollen and painful legs, and was unable to do much pulling. Joyce wrote on the 21st that Smith was worse, and that Mackintosh was showing signs of exhaustion. A mountain that he had believed to be Mount Hope could be seen right ahead, over 30 miles away. Spencer Smith, who had struggled forward gamely and made no unnecessary complaints, started with the party the next morning and kept going until shortly before noon. Then he reported his inability to proceed, and Mackintosh called a halt. Spencer Smith suggested that he should be left with provisions and a tent while the other members of the party pushed on to Mount Hope, and pluckily assured Mackintosh that the rest would put him right and he would be ready to march when they returned. The party agreed, after a brief consultation, to adopt this plan. Mackintosh felt that the depot must be laid, and that delay would be dangerous. Spencer Smith was left with a tent, 1 sledge, and provisions, and told to expect the returning party in about a week. The tent was made as comfortable as possible inside, and food was placed within the 6 man's reach. Spencer Smith bade his companions a cheery good-bye after lunch, and the party was 6 or 7 miles away before evening. 5 men had to squeeze into one tent that night, but with a minus temperature they did not object to being crowded. On January 23 a thick fog obscured all landmarks, and as bearings of the mountains were now necessary, the party had to camp at 11 a.m., after travelling only 4 miles. The thick weather continued over the 24th, and the men did not move again until the morning of the 25th. They did 17 3/4 miles that day, and camped at 6 p.m. on the edge of the biggest ice pressure Joyce had ever seen. They were steering in towards the mountains and were encountering the tremendous congestion created by the flow of the Beardmore Glacier into the barrier ice. We decided to keep the camp up, ran Joyce's account of the work done on January 26. Skipper, Richards, and myself roped ourselves together, I taking the lead, and tried to find a course through this pressure. We came across very wide crevasses, went down several, came on top of a very high ridge, and such a scene! Imagine thousands of tons of ice churned up to a depth of about 300 feet. We took a couple of photographs, then carried on to the east. At last we found a passage through, and carried on through smaller crevasses to Mount Hope, or we hoped it was the mountain by that name. We can see a great glacier ahead, which we will take for the Beardmore, which this mountain is on, but the position on the chart seems wrong. It was not. EHS. We nearly arrived at the ice foot when Richard saw something to the right, which turned out to be 2 of Captain Scott's sledges, upright, but 3/4 buried in snow. Then we knew for certain this was the place we had struggled to get to. Soon we climbed the glacier on the slope and went up about 1 1/4 miles, and saw the great Beardmore Glacier stretching to the south. It is about 25 miles wide, a most wonderful sight. Then we returned to our camp, which we found to be 6 miles away. We left at 8 a.m. and arrived back at 3 p.m., a good morning's work. We then had lunch. About 4 p.m. we got under way and proceeded with the 2 sledges and camped about 7 o'clock. Wild, Hayward, and myself then took the depot up the glacier, a fortnight's provisions. We left it lashed to a broken sledge and put up a large flag. I took 2 photographs of it. We did not arrive back until 10:30 p.m. It was rather a heavy pull-up. I was very pleased to see our work completed at last. Turned in at 12 o'clock. The distance done during the day, 22 miles. The party remained in camp until 3:30 p.m. on the 27th, owing to a blizzard with heavy snow. Then they made a start in clearer weather and got through the crevassed area before camping at 7 p.m. Joyce was suffering from snow blindness. They were now homeward bound, with 365 miles to go. They covered 16½ miles on the 28th, with Joyce absolutely blind and hanging to the harness for guidance, but still pulling his whack. They reached Spencer Smith's camp the next afternoon and found him in his sleeping bag, quite unable to walk. Joyce's diary of this date contains a rather gloomy reference to the outlook, since he guessed that Mackintosh would also be unable to make the homeward journey. "The dogs are still keeping fit," he added. "If they will only last to 80 degrees south, we shall have enough food to take them in, and then if the ship is in, I guarantee they will live in comfort the remainder of their lives." No march could be made on the 30th, since a blizzard was raging. The party made 8 miles on the 31st, with Spencer Smith on one of the sledges in his sleeping bag. The sufferer was quite helpless, and had to be lifted and carried about, but his courage did not fail him. His words were cheerful even when his physical suffering and weakness were most pronounced. The distance for February 1 was 13 miles. The next morning the party abandoned one sledge in order to lighten the load, and proceeded with a single sledge, Spencer Smith lying on top of the stores and gear. The distance for the day was 15½ miles. They picked up the 82 degrees south depot on February 3rd, and took 1 week's provisions, leaving 2 weeks' rations for the overland party. Joyce, Wild, Richards, and Hayward were feeling fit. Mackintosh was weak and lame. Spencer Smith's condition was alarming. The party was being helped by a strong southerly winds, and the distances covered were decidedly good. The sledge meter recorded 15 miles 1,700 yards on February 4, 17 miles 1,400 yards on the 5th, 18 miles 1,200 yards on the 6th, and 13 miles 1,000 yards on the 7th, when the 81 degrees south depot was picked up at 10:30 m, and 1 week's stores taken, 2 weeks' rations being left. The march to the next depot, at 80 degrees south, was uneventful. The party made good marches in spite of bad surfaces and thick weather, and reached the depot late in the afternoon of February 12. The supply of stores at this depot was ample, and the men took a fortnight's rations, calculated on a 3-man basis, leaving nearly 4 weeks' rations. Spencer Smith seemed a little better, and all hands were cheered by the rapid advance. February 14, 15, and 16 were bad days, the soft surface allowing the men to sink to their knees at times. The dogs had a rough time, and the daily distances fell to about 8 miles. Mackintosh's weakness was increasing. Then, on the 18th, when the party was within 12 miles of the Bluff depot, a furious blizzard made travelling impossible. This blizzard raged for 5 days. Rations were reduced on the 2nd day, and the party went on half rations the 3rd day. "Still blizzarding," wrote Joyce on the 20th. "Things are serious, what with our patient and provisions running short. Dog provisions are nearly out, and we have to have their rations. We are now on 1 cup of hoosh among the 3 of us, with 1 biscuit and 6 lumps of sugar. The most serious of calamities is that our oil is running out. We have plenty of tea, but no fuel to cook it with." The men in Mackintosh's tent were in no better plight. Mackintosh himself was in a bad way. He was uncertain about his ability to resume the march, but was determined to try. "Still blizzarding," wrote Joyce on the 21st. "We are lying in pools of water made by our bodies, through staying in the same place for such a long time. I don't know what we shall do if this does not ease. It has been blowing continuously without a lull. The food for today was 1 cup of pemmican amongst the 3 of us, 1 biscuit each, and 2 cups of tea among the 3. The kerosene was exhausted, but Richards improvised a lamp by pouring some spirit, intended for priming the oil lamp, into a mug, lighting it, and holding another mug over it. It took half an hour to heat a mug of melted snow in this way. "Same old thing, no ceasing of this blizzard," was Joyce's note 24 hours later. "Hardly any food left except tea and sugar. Richards, Hayward, and I, after a long talk, decided to get under way tomorrow in any case, or else we shall be sharing the fate of Captain Scott and his party. The other tent seems to be very quiet, but now and again we hear a burst of song from Wild, so they are in the land of the living. We gave the dogs the last of their food tonight, so we shall have to push, as a great deal depends on them." Further quotations from Joyce's diary tell their own story. February 23rd, Wednesday. About 11 o'clock saw a break in the clouds and the sun showing. Decided to have the meal we kept for getting under way. Sang out to the skipper's party that we should shift as soon as we had a meal. I asked Wild, and found that they had a bag of oatmeal, some Bovril cubes, 1 bag of chocolate, and 18 biscuits, so they are much better off than we are. After we had our meal we started to dig out our sledge, which we found right under. It took us 2 hours, and one would hardly credit how weak we are. 2 digs of the shovel and we were out of breath. This was caused through our lying up on practically no food. After getting the sledge out, we took it around to the skipper's tent on account of the heavy sastrugi, which was very high. Got under way about 2:20. Had to stop very often on account of sail, etc. About 3:20 the skipper, who had tied himself to the rear of the sledge, found it impossible to proceed. So, after a consultation with Wild and party, decided to pitch their tent, leaving Wild to look after the skipper and Spencer Smith, and make the best of our way to the depot, which is anything up to 12 miles away. So we made them comfortable and left them about 3:40. I told Wild I should leave as much as possible and get back 26th or 27th, weather permitting. But just as we left them it came on to snow pretty hard, sun going in, and we found even with the 4 dogs we could not make more than 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile an hour. The surface is so bad that sometimes you go in up to your waist. Still, in spite of all this, we carried on till 6:35. Camped in a howling blizzard. I found my left foot badly frostbitten. Now, after this march, we came into our banquet, 1 cup of tea and half a biscuit. Turned in at 9 o'clock. Situation does not look very cheerful. This is really the worst surface I have ever come across in all my journeys here. Mackintosh had stayed on his feet as long as was humanly possible. The records of the outward journey show clearly that he was really unfit to continue beyond the 82° south depot, and other members of the party would have liked him to have stayed with Spencer Smith at latitude 83° south. But the responsibility for the work to be done was primarily his, and he would not give in. He had been suffering for several weeks from what he cheerfully called a sprained leg, owing to scurvy. He marched for half an hour on the 23rd before breaking down, but had to be supported partly by Richards. Spencer Smith was sinking. Wild, who stayed in charge of the 2 invalids, was in fairly good condition. Joyce, Richards, and Hayward, who had undertaken the relief journey, were all showing symptoms of scurvy, though in varying degrees. Their legs were weak, their gums swollen. The decision that the invalids, with Wild, should stay in camp from February 24, while Joyce's party pushed forward to Bluff Depot, was justified fully by the circumstances. Joyce, Richards, and Hayward had difficulty in reaching the depot with a nearly empty sledge. An attempt to make their journey with 2 helpless men might have involved the loss of the whole party. February 24, Thursday. Up at 4:30. Had 1 cup of tea, half a biscuit. Under way after 7. Weather, snowing and blowing like yesterday. Richards, laying the cairns, had great trouble in getting the compass within 10 degrees on account of wind. During the forenoon had to stop every quarter of an hour on account of our breath. Every time the sledge struck a drift she stuck in, although only 200 pounds, and in spite of 3 men and 4 dogs we could only shift her with 1, 2, 3 haul. I wonder if this weather will ever clear up. Camped in an exhausted condition about 12:10. Lunch, half a cup of weak tea and a quarter biscuit, which took over half an hour to make. Richards and Hayward went out of tent to prepare for getting under way, but the force of wind and snow drove them back. The force of wind is about 70 to 80 miles per hour. We decided to get the sleeping bags in, which took some considerable time. The worst of camping is the poor dogs in our weak condition, which means we have to get out of our wet sleeping bags and have another half cup of tea, without working for it. With scrapings from dog tank, it is a very scanty meal. This is the second day the dogs have been without food, and if we cannot soon pick up depot and save the dogs, it will be almost impossible to drag our 2 invalids back the 100 miles which we have to go. The wind carried on with unabating fury until 7 o'clock, and then came a lull. We at once turned out, but found it snowing so thickly that it was impossible to proceed on account of our weakness. No chance must we miss. Turned in again. Wind sprang up again with heavy drift 8:30. In spite of everything, my tent mates are very cheerful, and look on the bright side of everything. After a talk we decided to wait and turn in. It is really wonderful what dreams we have, especially of food. Trusting in Providence for fine weather tomorrow. February 25, Friday. Turned out 4:45. Richards prepared our usual banquet, half cup of tea, quarter biscuit, which we relished. Under way at 7, carried on, halting every 10 minutes or quarter of an hour. Weather snowing and blowing same as yesterday. We are in a very weak state, but we cannot give in. We often talk about poor Captain Scott and the blizzard that finished him and party. If we had stayed in our tent another day, I don't think we should have got under way at all, and we would have shared the same fate. But if the worst comes, we have made up our minds to carry on and die in harness. If anyone were to see us on trek, they would be surprised. 3 men staggering on with 4 dogs, very weak, practically empty sledge with fair wind, and just crawling along. Our clothes are all worn out, finnesko and sleeping bags torn. Tent is our worst point, all torn in front, and we are afraid to camp on account of it, as it is too cold to mend it. We camped for our grand lunch at noon. After 5 hours struggling, I think we did about 3 miles. After lunch, sat in our tent talking over the situation. Decided to get under way again as soon as there is any clearance. Snowing and blowing, force about 50 or 60 miles an hour. February 26, Saturday. Richards went out at 1:10 a.m. and found it clearing a bit, so we got under way as soon as possible, which was 2:10 a.m. About 2:35 Richards sighted depot, which seemed to be right on top of us. I suppose we camped no more than 3/4 of a mile from it. The dogs sighted it, which seemed to electrify them. They had new life and started to run, but we were so weak that we could not go more than 200 yards and then spell. I think another day would have seen us off. Arrived at depot 3:25, found it in a dilapidated condition, cases all about the place. I don't suppose there has ever been a weaker party arrived at any depot, either north or south. After a hard struggle got our tent up and made camp. Then gave the dogs a good feed of pemmican. If ever dogs saved the life of anyone, they have saved ours. Let us hope they will continue in good health, so that we can get out to our comrades. I started on our cooking. Not one of us had any appetite, although we were in the land of plenty, as we call this depot, plenty of biscuit, etc., but we could not eat. I think it is the reaction, not only in arriving here, but also finding no news of the ship, which was arranged before we left. We all think there has been a calamity there. Let us hope for the best. We decided to have rolled oats and milk for a start, which went down very well, and then a cup of tea. How cheery the Primus sounds! It seems like coming out of a thick London fog into a drawing room. After a consultation, we decided to have a meal of pemmican in 4 hours, and so on until our weakness was gone. Later. Still the same weather. We shall get under way and make a forced march back as soon as possible. I think we shall get stronger travelling and feeding well. Later. Weather will not permit us to travel yet. Mended our torn tent with food bags. This took 4 hours. Feeding the dogs every 4 hours, and Richards and Hayward built up depot. It is really surprising to find it takes 2 men to lift a 50-pound case. It only shows our weakness. Weather still the same, force of wind at times about 70 to 90 miles an hour. Really surprising how this can keep on so long. End of chapter 15, part 1. Chapter 15, Part 2 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South. The Story of Shackleton's Last Expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 5. Laying the Depots, Part 2. February 27, Sunday. Wind continued with fury the whole night. Expecting every minute to have the tent blown off of us. Up 5 o'clock, found it so thick one could not get out of the tent. We are still very weak, but think we can do the 12 miles to our comrades in one long march. If only it would clear up for just one day we would not mind. This is the longest continuous blizzard I have ever been in. We have not had a travelling day for 11 days, and the amount of snow that has fallen is astonishing. Later. Had a meal 10:30 and decided to get under way in spite of the wind and snow. Under way 12 o'clock. We have 3 weeks' food on sledge, about 160 pounds, and 1 week's dog food, 50 pounds. The whole weight, all told, about 600 pounds, and also taking an extra sledge to bring back Captain Mackintosh. To our surprise, we could not shift the sledges. After half an hour we got about 10 yards. We turned the sledge up and scraped runners. It went a little better after. I am afraid our weakness is much more than we think. Hayward is in rather a bad way about his knees, which are giving him trouble and are very painful. We will give him a good massage when we camp. The dogs have lost all heart in pulling. They seem to think that going south again is no good to them. They seem to just jog along, and one cannot do more. I don't suppose our pace is more than 1/2 or 3/4 of a mile per hour. The surface is rotten, snow up to one's knees, and what with wind and drift a very bad outlook. Lunched about 4:30. Carried on until 11:20, when we camped. It was very dark making our dinner, but soon got through the process. Then Richard spent an hour or so in rubbing Hayward with methylated spirits, which did him a world of good. If he were to break up now, I should not know what to do. Turned in about 1:30. It is calm now, but overcast with light falling snow. February 28, Monday. Up at 6 o'clock, can just see a little skyline. Under way at 9 o'clock. The reason of delay, had to mend finneskoe, which are in a very dilapidated condition. I got my feet badly frostbitten yesterday. About 11 o'clock came on to snow, everything overcast. We ought to reach our poor boys in 3 or 4 hours, but fate wills otherwise, as it came on again to blizzard force about 11:45. Camped at noon. I think the party must be within a very short distance, but we cannot go on as we might pass them, and as we have not got any position to go on except compass. Later, kept on blizzarding all afternoon and night. February 29, Tuesday. Up at 5 o'clock, still very thick. It cleared up a little to the south about 8 o'clock, when Richard sighted something black to the north of us, but could not see properly what it was. After looking round sighted camp to the south, so we got under way as soon as possible. Got up to camp about 12:45, when Wild came out to meet us. We gave him a cheer, as we fully expected to find all down. He said he had taken a little exercise every day. They had not any food left. The skipper then came out of the tent, very weak, and as much as he could do to walk. He said, "I want to thank you for saving our lives." I told Wild to go and give them a feed, and not to eat too much at first in case of reaction, as I am going to get under way as soon as they have had a feed. So we had lunch, and the skipper went ahead to get some exercise, and after an hour's digging out, got everything ready for leaving. When we lifted Smith, we found he was in a great hole which he had melted through. This party had been in one camp for 12 days. We got under way and picked the skipper up. He had fallen down, too weak to walk. We put him on the sledge we had brought out, and we camped about 8 o'clock. I think we did about 3 miles, rather good with 2 men on the sledges and Hayward in a very bad way. I don't think there has been a party, either north or south, in such straits, 3 men down and 3 of us very weak, but the dogs seem to have a new life since we turned north. I think they realize they are homeward bound. I am glad we kept them, even when we were starving. I knew they would have to come in at the finish. We now have to look forward to southerly winds for help, which I think we shall get at this time of year. Let us hope the temperature will keep up, as our sleeping bags are wet through and worn out, and all our clothes full of holes, and finnesko in a dilapidated condition. In fact, one would not be out on a cold day in civilization with the rotten clothes we have on. Turned in 11 o'clock, wet through but in a better frame of mind. Hope to try and reach the depot tomorrow, even if we have to march overtime. March 1, Wednesday. Turned out usual time, a good south wind, but worse luck, heavy drift. Set sail, put the skipper on rear sledge. The temperature has gone down and it is very cold. Bluff in sight. We are making good progress, doing a good mileage before lunch. After lunch a little stronger wind. Hayward still hanging on to sledge. Skipper fell off twice. Reached depot 5:45. When camping found that we had dropped our tent poles, so Richards went back a little way and spotted them through the binoculars about half a mile off, and brought them back. Hayward and I were very cold by that time, the drift very bad. Moral: see everything properly secured. We soon had our tent up, cooked our dinner in the dark, and turned in about 12 o'clock. March 2nd, Thursday. Up as usual. Strong southwest wind with heavy drift. Took 2 weeks' provisions from the depot. I think that will last us through, as there is another depot about 50 miles north from here. I am taking the outside course on account of the crevasses, and one cannot take too many chances with 2 men on sledges and 1 crippled. Under way about 10 o'clock, lunched noon in a heavy drift, took an hour to get the tents up, etc., the wind being so heavy. Found sledges buried under snow after lunch, took some time to get under way. Wind and drift very heavy, set half sail on the first sledge, and under way about 3:30. The going is perfect, sometimes sledges overtaking us. Carried on until 8 o'clock, doing an excellent journey for the day, distance about 11 or 12 miles. Gives one a bit of heart to carry on like this, only hope we can do this all the way. Had to cook our meals in the dark, but still we did not mind. Turned in about 11 o'clock, pleased with ourselves, although we were wet through with snow, as it got through all the holes in our clothes, and the sleeping bags are worse than awful. March 3, Friday. Up the usual time. It has been blowing a raging blizzard all night. Found to our disgust utterly impossible to carry on. Another few hours of agony in these rotten bags. Later. Blizzard much heavier. Amused myself mending finnesko and Burberry's mitts and socks. Had the Primus while this operation was in force. Hoping for a fine day tomorrow. March 4, Saturday. Up 5:20. Still blizzarding, but have decided to get under way, as we will have to try and travel through everything, as Hayward is getting worse, and one doesn't know who is the next. No mistake, it is scurvy, and the only possible cure is fresh food. I sincerely hope the ship is in. If not, we shall get over the hills by Castle Rock, which is rather difficult and will delay another couple of days. Smith is still cheerful. He has hardly moved for weeks, and he has to have everything done for him. Got under way 9:35. It took some 2 hours to dig out dogs and sledges, as they were completely buried. It is the same every morning now. Set sail, going along pretty fair. Hayward gets on sledge now and again. Lunched as usual, sledges got buried again at lunchtime. It takes some time to camp now, and in this drift it is awful. In the afternoon wind eased a bit and drift went down. Found it very hard pulling with a 3rd man on sledge, as Hayward has been on all the afternoon. Wind veered 2 points to south, so we had a fair wind. An hour before we camped, Erebus and Terror showing up, a welcome sight. Only hope wind will continue. Drift is worst thing to contend with, as it gets into our clothes, which are wet through now. Camped 8 o'clock. Cooked in the dark, and turned in our wet sleeping bags about 10 o'clock. Distance about 8 or 9 miles. March 5, Sunday. Turned out 6:15. Overslept a little, very tired after yesterday. Sun shining brightly and no wind. It seemed strange last night, no flapping of tent in one's ears. About 8:30 came in to drift again. Under way 9:20, both sails set. Sledge going hard, especially in soft places. If Hayward had not broken down, we should not feel the weight so much. Lunch 12:45. Under way at 3. Wind and drift very heavy. A good job it is blowing some, or else we should have to relay. All land obscured. Distance about 10 or 11 miles, a very good performance. Camped 7:10 in the dark. Patience not in the best of trim. I hope to get in, bar accidents, in 4 days. March 6, Monday. Underway 9:20. Picked up 32-mile depot 11 o'clock. Going with a fair wind in the forenoon, which eased somewhat after lunch and so caused very heavy work in pulling. It seems to me we shall have to depot someone if the wind eases at all. Distance during day about 8 miles. March 7, Tuesday. Underway 9 o'clock. Although we turn out at 5, it seems a long time to get underway. There is double as much work to do now with our invalids. This is the calmest day we have had for weeks. The sun is shining and all land in sight. It is very hard going. Had a little breeze about 11 o'clock, set sail, but work still very, very heavy. Hayward and skipper going on ahead with sticks, very slow pace, but it will buck them up and do them good. If one could only get some fresh food! About 11 o'clock decided to camp and overhaul sledges and depot all gear except what is actually required. Underway again at 2, but surface being so sticky did not make any difference. After a consultation with the skipper, decided to stay behind in a tent with 3 weeks' provisions, whilst we push on with Smith and Hayward. It seems hard, only about 30 miles away, and yet cannot get any assistance. Our gear is absolutely rotten. No sleep last night, shivering all night in wet bags. I wonder what will be the outcome of it all after our struggle. Trust in Providence. Distance about 3½ miles. March 8, Wednesday. Underway 9:20. Wished the skipper good-bye, took Smith and Hayward on. Had a fair wind, going pretty good. Hope to arrive in Hut Point in 4 days. Lunched at No. 2 depot. Distance about 4½ miles. Underway as usual after lunch, headwind, going very heavy. Carried on until 6:30. Distance about 8 or 9 miles. March 9, Thursday. Had a very bad night, cold intense. Temperature down to -29 degrees all night. At 4 a.m. Spencer Smith called out that he was feeling queer. Wild spoke to him. Then at 5:45 Richard suddenly said, "I think he is gone." Poor Smith! For 40 days in pain he had been dragged on the sledge, but never grumbled or complained. He had a strenuous time in his wet bag, and the jolting of the sledge on a very weak heart was not too good for him. Sometimes when we lifted him on the sledge he would nearly faint, but during the whole time he never complained. Wild looked after him from the start. We buried him in his bag at 9 o'clock on the following position: Arab 184 degrees, Obbs Hill 149 degrees. We made a cross of bamboos and built a mound and a cairn with particulars. After that got under way with Hayward on sledge. Found going very hard, as we had a northerly wind in our faces, with the temperature below 20 degrees. What with frostbites, etc., we are all suffering. Even the dogs seem like giving in. They do not seem to take any interest in their work. We have been out much too long, and nothing ahead to cheer us up but cold, cheerless hut. We did about 2½ miles in the forenoon, Hayward toddling ahead every time we had a spell. During lunch the wind veered to the south with drift, just right to set sail. We carried on with Hayward on sledge and camped in the dark about 8 o'clock. Turned in at 10, weary, worn, and sad. Hoping to reach depot tomorrow. March 10, Friday. Turned out as usual. Beam wind, going pretty fair, very cold. Came into very soft snow about 3, arrived at safety camp 5 o'clock. Got to edge of ice barrier, found passage over in a bay full of seals. Dogs got very excited, had a job to keep them away. By the glass it looks clear to Cape Armitage, which is 4½ miles away. Arrived there 8 o'clock, very dark and a bad light. Found open water. Turned to climb slopes against a strong northeasterly breeze with drift. Found a place about a mile away, but we were so done up that it took until 11:30 to get gear up. This slope was about 150 yards up, and every 3 paces we had to stop and get breath. Eventually camped and turned in about 2 o'clock. I think this is the worst day I ever spent. What with the disappointment of not getting around the point, and the long day and the thought of getting Hayward over the slopes, it is not very entertaining for sleep. March 11, Saturday. Up at 7 o'clock. Took binoculars and went over the slope to look around the cape. To my surprise, found the open water and pack at the cape only extended for about a mile. Came down and gave the boys the good news. I think it would take another 2 hard days to get over the hills, and we are too weak to do much of that, as I am afraid of another collapsing. Richards and Wild climbed up to look at the back of the bay and found the ice secure. Got under way 10:30, went round the cape and found ice, very slushy, but continued on. No turning now, got into hard ice shortly after, arriving eventually at Hut Point about 3 o'clock. It seems strange after our adventures to arrive back at the old hut. This place has been standing ever since we built it in 1901, and has been the starting point of a few expeditions since. When we were coming down the bay, I could fancy the Discovery there when Scott arrived from his farthest south in 1902, the ship decorated rainbow fashion, and Lieutenant Armitage giving out the news that Captain Scott had got to 82 degrees 17 minutes south. We went wild that day. But now our homecoming is quite different. Hut half full of snow through a window being left open and drift getting in, but we soon got it ship-shape and Hayward in. I had the fire going and plenty of vegetables on, as there was a fair supply of dried vegetables. Then, after we had a feed, Richards and Wild went down the bay and killed a couple of seals. I gave a good menu of seal meat at night, and we turned in about 11 o'clock, full, too full in fact. As there is no news here of the ship, and we cannot see her, we surmise she has gone down with all hands. I cannot see there is any chance of her being afloat, or she would be here. I don't know how the skipper will take it. March 12, Sunday. Heard groans proceeding from the sleeping bags all night, all hands suffering from overeating. Hayward not very well. Turned out 8 o'clock. Good breakfast, porridge, seal, vegetables and coffee, more like a banquet to us. After breakfast, Richards and Wild killed a couple of seals, whilst I made the hut a bit comfy. Hayward can hardly move. All of us in a very bad state, but we must keep up exercise. My ankles and knees badly swollen, gums prominent. Wild very black around joints, and gums very black. Richards about the best off. After digging hut out I prepared food which I think will keep the scurvy down. The dogs have lost their lassitude and are quite frisky, except Oscar, who is suffering from overfeeding. After a strenuous day's work, turned in 10 o'clock. March 13, Monday. Turned out 7 o'clock. Carried on much the same as yesterday, bringing in seal blubber and meat. Preparing for departure tomorrow, hope everyone will be all right. Made new dog harness and prepared sledges. In afternoon cooked sufficient seal meat for our journey out and back, and same for dogs. Turned in 10 o'clock, feeling much better. March 14, Tuesday. A beautiful day. Under way after lunch. One would think, looking at our party, that we were the most ragged lot one could meet in a day's march, all our clothes past mending, our faces as black as niggerses, a sort of crowd one would run away from. Going pretty good. As soon as we rounded Cape Armitage, a dead head wind with a temperature of -18 degrees Fahrenheit, so we are not in for a pleasant time. Arrived at Safety Camp 6 o'clock, turned in 8:30 after getting everything ready. March 15, Wednesday. Under way as usual. Nice calm day. Had a very cold night, temperature going down to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Going along at a rattling good rate, in spite of our swollen limbs we did about 15 miles. Very cold when we camped, temperature -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Turned in 9 o'clock. March 12, Thursday. Up before the sun, 4:45 a.m. Had a very cold night, not much sleep. Under way early, going good. Passed Smith's grave 10:45 a.m. and had lunch at depot. Saw skipper's camp just after, and looking through glass found him outside the tent, much to the joy of all hands, as we expected him to be down. Picked him up 4:15 p.m. broke the news of Smith's death and no ship. I gave him the date of the 17th to look out for our returning, so he had a surprise. We struck his camp and went north for about a mile and camped. We gave the skipper a banquet of seal, vegetables, and blackcurrant jam, the feed of his life. He seems in a bad way. I hope to get him in 3 days, and I think fresh food will improve him. We turned in 8 o'clock. Distance done during day 16 miles. March 17, Friday. Up at 5 o'clock. Under way 8 a.m. Skipper feeling much better after feeding him up. Lunched a few yards past Smith's grave. Had a good afternoon, going fair. Distance about 16 miles. Very cold night, temperature -30°F. What with wet bags and clothes rotten. March 18, Saturday. Turned out at 5 o'clock. Had rather a cold night. Temperature -29°F. Surface very good. The skipper walked for a little way, which did him good. Lunched as usual. Pace good. After lunch going good. Arrived at Safety Camp 4:10 p.m. To our delight found the sea ice in the same condition and arrived at Hut Point 7 o'clock. Found Hayward still about the same. Set to, made a good dinner, and all hands seem in the best of spirits. Now we have arrived and got the party in, it remains to themselves to get better. Plenty of exercise and fresh food ought to do miracles. We have been out 160 days and done a distance of 1,561 miles, a good record. I think the irony of fate was poor Smith going under a day before we got in. I think we shall all soon be well. Turned in 10:30 p.m. Before turning in, skipper shook us by the hand with great emotion, thanking us for saving his life. Richards, summarizing the work of the parties, says that the journeys made between September 1 and March 18, a period of 160 days, totaled 1,561 miles. The main journey from Hut Point to Mount Hope and return was 830 miles. The equipment, he adds, was old at the commencement of the season, and this told severely at the later stages of the journey. 3 Primus lamps gave out on the journeys, and the old tent brought back by one of the last parties showed rents several feet in length. This hampered the travelling in the long blizzards. Finneskoe were also in pieces at the end, and time had frequently to be lost through repairs to clothing becoming imperative. This account would not be complete without some mention of the unselfish service rendered to Wild to his 2 ill tent mates from the time he remained behind the long blizzard till the death of Spencer Smith. He had 2 helpless men to attend to, and despite his own condition he was ever ready, night or day, to minister to their wants. This, in a temperature of -30°F, at times was no light task. Without the aid of our faithful friends, Oscar, Kahn, Gunner, and Towser, the party could never have arrived back. These dogs, from November 5, accompanying the sledging parties, and although the pace was often very slow, they adapted themselves well to it. Their endurance was fine. For 3 whole days at one time they had not a scrap of food, and this after a period on short rations. Though they were feeble towards the end of the trip, their condition usually was good, and those who returned with them will ever remember the remarkable service they rendered. The first indication of anything wrong with the general health of the party occurred about latitude 82° 30' south, when Spencer Smith complained of stiffness in the legs and discoloration. He attributed this to holes in his windproof clothing. At latitude 83° south, when he gave way, it was thought that the rest would do him good. About the end of January, Captain Mackintosh showed very serious signs of lameness. At this time his party had been absent from Hut Point, and consequently from fresh food, about 3 months. On the journey back Spencer Smith gradually became weaker, and for some time before the end was in a very weak condition indeed. Captain Mackintosh, by great efforts, managed to keep his feet until the long blizzard was encountered. Here it was that Hayward was first found to be affected with the scurvy, his knees being stiff. In his case the disease took him off his feet very suddenly, apparently causing the muscles of his legs to contract till they could be straightened hardly more than a right angle. He had slight touches in the joints of the arms. In the cases of Joyce, Wild, and Richards, Joints became stiff and black in the rear, but generally weakness was the worst symptom experienced. Captain Mackintosh's legs looked the worst in the party. The 5 men who were now at Hut Point found quickly that some of the winter months must be spent there. They had no news of the ship, and were justified in assuming that she had not returned to the Sound, since if she had, some message would have been awaiting them at Hut Point, if not farther south. The sea ice had broken and gone north within a mile of the point, and the party must wait until the new ice became firm as far as Cape Evans. Plenty of seal meat was available, as well as dried vegetables, and the fresh food improved the condition of the patients very rapidly. Richards massaged the swollen joints and found that this treatment helped a good deal. Before the end of March, Mackintosh and Hayward, the worst sufferers, were able to take exercise. By the 2nd week of April, Mackintosh was free of pain, though the backs of his legs were still discolored. A tally of the stores at the hut showed that on a reasonable allowance the supply would last until the middle of June. Richards and Wild killed many seals, so that there was no scarcity of meat and blubber. A few penguins were also secured. The sole means of cooking food and heating the hut was an improvised stove of brick covered with 2 sheets of iron. This had been used by the former expedition. The stove emitted dense smoke and often made the hut very uncomfortable, while at the same time it covered the men and all their gear with clinging and penetrating soot. Cleanliness was out of the question, and this increased the desire of the men to get across to Cape Evans. During April the sea froze in calm weather, but winds took the ice out again. On April 23 Joyce walked 4 miles to the north, partly on young ice 2 inches thick, and he thought then that the party might be able to reach Cape Evans within a few days. But a prolonged blizzard took the ice right out up to the point, so that the open water extended at the end of April right up to the foot of Vinnie's Hill. Then came a spell of calm weather, and during the first week of May the sea ice formed rapidly. The men made several short trips over it to the north. The sun had disappeared below the horizon in the middle of April, and would not appear again for over 4 months. The disaster that followed is described by both Richards and Joyce. "And now a most regrettable incident occurred," wrote Richards. On the morning of May 8, before breakfast, Captain Mackintosh asked Joyce what he thought of his going to Cape Evans with Hayward. Captain Mackintosh considered the ice quite safe, and the fine morning no doubt tempted him to exchange the quarters at the hut for the greater comfort and better food at Cape Evans. Mackintosh naturally would be anxious to know if the men at Cape Evans were well and had had any news of the ship. He was strongly urged at the time not to take the risk, as it was pointed out that the ice, although firm, was very young, and that a blizzard was almost sure to take part of it out to sea. However, at about 1 p.m., with the weather apparently changing for the worse, Mackintosh and Hayward left, after promising to turn back if the weather grew worse. The last sight the watching party on the hill gained of them was when they were about a mile away, close to shore, but apparently making straight for Cape Evans. At 3 p.m. a moderate blizzard was raging, which later increased in fury, and the party in the hut had many misgivings for the safety of the absent men. On May 10, the first day possible, the 3 men left behind walked over new ice to the north to try and discover some traces as to the fate of the others. The footmarks were seen clearly enough raised up on the ice, and the track was followed for about 2 miles in a direction leading to Cape Evans. Here they ended abruptly, and in the dim light a wide stretch of water, very lightly covered with ice, was seen as far as the eye could reach. It was at once evident that part of the ice over which they had travelled had gone out to sea. The whole party had intended, if the weather had held good, to have attempted the passage across with the full moon about May 16. On the date on which Mackintosh and Hayward left it was impossible that a sledge should travel the distance over the sea ice, owing to the sticky nature of the surface. Hence their decision to go alone and leave the others to follow with the sledge and equipment when the surface should improve. That they had actually been lost was learned only on July 15, on which date the party from Hut Point arrived at Cape Evans. The entry in Joyce's diary shows that he had had very strong forebodings of disaster when Mackintosh and Hayward left. He warned them not to go, as the ice was still thin and the weather was uncertain. Mackintosh seems to have believed that he and Hayward, travelling light, could get across to Cape Evans quickly before the weather broke, and if the blizzard had come 2 or 3 hours later they probably would have been safe. The two men carried no sleeping bags and only a small meal of chocolate and seal meat. The weather during June was persistently bad. No move had been possible on May 16, the sea ice being out, and Joyce decided to wait until the next full moon. When this came the weather was boisterous, and so it was not until the full moon of July that the journey to Cape Evans was made. During June and July seals got very scarce, and the supply of blubber ran short. Meals consisted of little but seal meat and porridge. The small stock of salt was exhausted, but the men procured 2½ pounds by boiling down snow taken from the bottom layer next to the sea ice. The dogs recovered condition rapidly, and did some hunting on their own account among the seals. The party started for Cape Evans on July 15. They had expected to take advantage of the full moon, but by a strange chance they had chosen the period of an eclipse, and the moon was shadowed most of the time they were crossing the sea ice. The ice was firm, and the 3 men reached Cape Evans without difficulty. They found Stevens, Cope, Gaze, and Jack at the Cape Evans hut, and learned that nothing had been seen of Captain Mackintosh and Hayward. The conclusion that these men had perished was accepted reluctantly. The party at the base consisted now of Stevens, Cope, Joyce, Richards, Gaze, Wild, and Jack. The men settled down now to wait for relief. When opportunity offered, Joyce led search parties to look for the bodies or any trace of the missing men, and he subsequently handed me the following report. I beg to report that the following steps were taken to try and discover the bodies of Captain Mackintosh and Mr. Hayward. After our party's return to the hut at Cape Evans, July 15, 1916, it was learned that Captain Mackintosh and Mr. Hayward had not arrived, and being aware of the conditions under which they were last seen, all the members of the wintering party were absolutely convinced that these 2 men were totally lost and dead, that they could not have lived for more than a few hours at the outside in the blizzard that they had encountered, they being entirely unprovided with equipment of any sort. There was the barest chance that after the return of the sun some trace of their bodies might be found, so during the spring, that is, August and September 1916, and in the summer, December and January 1916 to 1917, the following searches were carried out. 1. Wild and I thoroughly searched Inaccessible Island at the end of August 1916. 2. Various parties in September searched along the shore to the vicinity of Turk's Head. 3. In company with Messrs. Wild and Gaze, I started from Hut Point, December 31, 1916, at 8 a.m., and a course was steered inshore as close as possible to the cliffs in order to search for any possible means of ascent. At a distance of half a mile from Hut Point we passed a snow slope which I had already ascended in June 1916. 3½ miles farther on was another snow slope, which ended in Blue Ice Glacier Slope, which we found impossible to climb, snow slope being formed by heavy winter snowfall. These were the only 2 places accessible. Distance on this day 10 miles 1710 yards covered. On January 1, search was continued round the south side of Glacier Tongue from the base towards the seaward end. There was much heavy pressure. It was impossible to reach the summit owing to the wide crack. Distance covered 4 miles 100 yards. On January 2, thick weather caused party to lay up. On 3rd, Glacier was further examined, and several slopes formed by snow led to the top of Glacier, but crevasses between slope and the tongue prevented crossing. The party then proceeded round the tongue to Tent Island, which was also searched, a complete tour of the island being made. It was decided to make for Cape Evans, as thick weather was approaching. We arrived at 8 p.m. Distance 8 miles 490 yards. I remain, etc., Ernest E. Joyce. To Sir Ernest Shackleton, C.V.O., Commander, I.T.A.E. In September Richards was forced to lay up at the hut owing to a strained heart, due presumably to stress of work on the sledging journeys. Early in October a party consisting of Joyce, Gaze, and Wild spent several days at Cape Royds, where they skinned specimens. They sledged stores back to Cape Evans in case it should be found necessary to remain there over another winter. In September, Joyce, Gaze, and Wild went out to Spencer Smith's grave with a wooden cross, which they erected firmly. Relief arrived on January 10, 1917, but it is necessary now to turn back to the events of May 1915, when the Aurora was driven from her moorings off Cape Evans. End of Chapter 15, Part 2.
Chapter 16, Part 1 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. South. The story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 16, Part 1. The Aurora's Drift. After Mackintosh left the Aurora on January 25, 1915, Stenhouse kept the ship with difficulty off Tent Island. The ice anchors would not hold, owing to the continual breaking away of the pack, and he found it necessary much of the time to steam slow ahead against the floes. The third sledging party, under Cope, left the ship on the afternoon of the 31st, with the motor tractor towing 2 sledges, and disappeared towards Hut Point. Cope's party returned to the ship on February 2nd and left again on February 5th, after a delay caused by the loose condition of the ice. 2 days later, after more trouble with drifting floes, Stenhouse proceeded to Cape Evans, where he took a line of soundings for the winter quarters. During the next month the Aurora occupied various positions in the neighbourhood of Cape Evans. No secure moorings were available. The ship had to keep clear of threatening floes, dodge growlers and drifting bergs, and find shelter from the blizzards. A sudden shift of wind on February 24th, when the ship was sheltering in the lee of Glacier Tongue, caused her to be jammed hard against the low ice off the glacier, but no damage was done. Early in March, Stenhouse sent moorings ashore at Cape Evans, and on March 11th he proceeded to Hut Point, where he dropped anchor in Discovery Bay. Here he landed stores, amounting to about 2 months' full rations for 12 men, and embarked Spencer Smith, Stevens, Hooke, Richards, Ninnis, and Gaze, with 2 dogs. He returned to Cape Evans that evening. We had a bad time when we were sculling about the Sound, first endeavouring to make Hut Point to land provisions, and then looking for winter quarters in the neighbourhood of Glacier Tongue, wrote Stenhouse afterwards. The ice kept breaking away in small floes, and we were apparently no nearer to anywhere than where the sledges left. We were frustrated in every move. The ship broke away from the fast ice in blizzards, and then we went dodging about the Sound from the Ross Island side to the western pack, avoiding and clearing floes and growlers in heavy drift when we could see nothing, our compasses unreliable and the ship short-handed. In that homeless time I kept watch and watch with the second officer, and was hard-pressed to know what to do. Was ever ship in such predicament? To the northward of Cape Royds was taboo, as also was the coast south of Glacier Tongue. In a small stretch of ice-bound coast we had to find winter quarters. The ice lingered on, and all this time we could find nowhere to drop anchor, but had to keep steam handy for emergencies. Once I tried the north bay of Cape Evans, as it apparently was the only ice-free spot. I called all hands, and, making up a boat's crew with one of the firemen, sent the whaler away with the second officer in charge to sound. No sooner had the boat left ship than the wind freshened from the northward, and large bergs and growlers setting into the bay made the place untenable. The anchorage I eventually selected seemed the best available, and here we are drifting, with all plans upset, when we ought to be lying in winter quarters. A heavy gale came up on March 12, and the Aurora, then moored off Cape Evans, dragged her anchor and drifted out of the bay. She went northward past Cape Barne and Cape Royds in a driving mist, with a heavy storm sea running. This gale was a particularly heavy one. The ship and gear were covered with ice, owing to the freezing of spray, and Stenhouse had anxious hours amid the heavy, ice-encumbered waters, before the gale moderated. The young ice, which was continually forming in the very low temperature, helped to reduce the sea as soon as the gale moderated, and the Aurora got back to Cape Evans on the evening of the 13th. Ice was forming in the bay, and on the morning of the 14th Stenhouse took the ship into position for winter moorings. He got 3 steel hawsers out and made fast to the shore anchors. These hawsers were hove tight, and the Aurora rested then, with her stern to the shore, in 7 fathoms. 2 more wires were taken ashore the next day. Young ice was forming around the ship, and under the influence of wind and tide this ice began early to put severe strains upon the moorings. Stenhouse had the fires drawn and the boiler blown down on the 20th, and the engineer reported at that time that the bunkers contained still 118 tons of coal. The ice broke away between Cape Evans and Cape Barne on the 23rd, and pressure around the ship shattered the bay ice and placed heavy strains on the stern moorings. The young ice, about 4 inches thick, went out eventually and left a lead along the shore. The ship had set in towards the shore owing to the pressure, and the stern was now in 4½ fathoms. Stenhouse tightened the moorings and ran out an extra wire to the shore anchor. The nature of the ice movements is illustrated by a few extracts from the log. March 27th, 5 p.m. Ice broke away from shore and started to go out. 8 p.m. Light southerly airs. Fine. Ice setting out to northwest. Heavy pressure of ice on starboard side and great strain on moorings. 10 p.m. Ice clear of ship. March 28th. New ice forming over bay. 3 a.m. Ice which went out last watch set in towards bay. 5 a.m. Ice coming in and overriding newly formed bay ice. Heavy pressure on port side of ship. Wires frozen into ice. 8 a.m. Calm and fine. New ice setting out of bay. 5 p.m. New ice formed since morning cleared from bay, except area on port side of ship and stretching a beam and a head for about 200 yards, which is held by bights of wire. New ice forming. March 29th, 1:30 p.m. New ice going out. 2 p.m. Hands on floe on port quarter clearing wires. Stern in 3 fathoms. Hold wires tight, bringing stern more to eastward and in 4 fathoms. Hove in about 1 fathom of starboard cable, which had dragged during recent pressure. April 10th, 1:30 p.m. Ice breaking from shore under influence of southeast wind. 2 starboard quarter wires parted. All bights of stern wires frozen in ice. Chain taking weight. 2 p.m. Ice opened, leaving ice in bay in line from cape to landward of glacier. 8 p.m. Fresh wind. Ship holding ice in bay. Ice in sound, wind driven to northwest. April 17th, 1 a.m. Pressure increased and wind shifted to northwest. Ice continued to override and press into shore until 5 o'clock. During this time, pressure into bay was very heavy. Movement of ice in straits causing noise like heavy surf. Ship took ground gently at rudder post during pressure. Bottom and the stern shallows very quickly. 10 p.m. Ice moving out of bay to westward. Heavy strain on after moorings and cables, which are cutting the flow. Stenhouse continued to nurse his moorings against the onslaughts of the ice during the rest of April and the early days of May. The breakaway from the shore came suddenly and unexpectedly on the evening of May 6th. May 6th, 1915. Fine morning with light breezes from east-southeast. 3:30 p.m. Ice nearly finished. Sent hands ashore for sledge load. 4 p.m. Wind freshening with blizzardy appearance of sky. 8 p.m. Heavy strain on after moorings. 9:45 p.m. The ice parted from the shore. All moorings parted. Most fascinating to listen to waves and chain breaking. In the thick haze I saw the ice astern breaking up and the shore receding. I called all hands and clapped relieving tackles, 4-inch Manila luff tackles, onto the cables on the forepart of the windlass. The boatswain had rushed along with his hurricane lamp and shouted, "She's away with it!" He's a good fellow and very conscientious. I ordered steam on main engines, and the engine room staff with Hook and Ninnis turned to. Grady, fireman, was laid up with a broken rib. As the ship in the solid floe set to the northwest, The cables rattled and tore at the hawse pipes. Luckily, the anchors, lying as they were on a stripped sloping bottom, came easily away, without damage to windlass or hawse pipes. Slowly, as we disappeared into sound, the light in the hut died away. At 11:30 p.m. the ice around us started to break up, the floes playing tattoo on the ship's sides. We were out in the sound and catching the full force of the wind. The moon broke through the clouds after midnight and showed us the pack, stretching continuously to northward, and about 1 mile to the south. As the pack from the southward came up and closed in on the ship, the swell lessened, and the banging of floes alongside eased a little. May 7th, 8 a.m. Wind east-southeast. Moderate gale with thick drift. The ice around ship is packing up and forming ridges about 2 feet high. The ship is lying with head to the eastward, Cape Bird showing to northeast. When steam is raised, I have hopes of getting back to the fast ice near the glacier tongue. Since we have been in winter quarters, the ice has formed and, held by the islands and land at Cape Evans, has remained north of the tongue. If we can return, we should be able now to moor to the fast ice. The engineers are having great difficulty with the sea connections, which are frozen. The main bow-down cock, from which the boiler is run up, has been tapped, and a screw plug put into it to allow of a hot iron rod being inserted to thaw out the ice between the cock and the ship's side, about 2 feet of hard ice. 4:30 p.m. The hot iron has been successful. Donnelly, second engineer, had the pleasure of stopping the first spurt of water through the pipe. He got it in the eye. Fires were lit in furnaces, and water commenced to blow in the boiler, the first blow in our defence against the terrific forces of nature in the Antarctic. 8 p.m. The gale has freshened, accompanied by thick drift. The Aurora drifted helplessly throughout May 7th. On the morning of May 8th, the weather cleared a little, and the western mountains became indistinctly visible. Cape Bird could also be seen. The ship was moving northwards with the ice. The daylight was no more than a short twilight of about 2 hours' duration. The boiler was being filled with ice, which had to be lifted aboard, broken up, passed through a small porthole to a man inside, and then carried to the manhole on top of the boiler. Stenhouse had the wireless aerial rigged during the afternoon, and at 5 p.m. was informed that the watering of the boiler was complete. The wind freshened to a moderate southerly gale, with thick drift, in the night, and this gale continued during the following day, the 9th. The engineer reported at noon that he had 40 pounds pressure in the boiler, and was commencing the thawing of the auxiliary sea connection pump by means of a steam pipe. Cape Bird is the only land visible, bearing northeast true about 8 miles distant, wrote Stenhouse on the afternoon of the 9th. So this is the end of our attempt to winter in McMurdo Sound. Hard luck after 4 months' buffeting, for the last 7 weeks of which we nursed our moorings. Our present situation calls for increasing vigilance. It is 5 weeks to the middle of winter. There is no sun, the light is little and uncertain, and we may expect many blizzards. We have no immediate water supply, as only a small quantity of fresh ice was aboard when we broke drift. The Aurora is fast in the pack and drifting God knows where. Well, there are prospects of a most interesting winter drift. We are all in good health, except Grady, whose rib is mending rapidly. We have good spirits, and we will get through. But what of the poor beggars at Cape Evans and the southern party? It is a dismal prospect for them. There are sufficient provisions at Cape Evans, Hut Point, and I suppose Cape Royds, but we have the remaining Burberrys, clothing, etc. for next year's sledging, still on board. I see little prospect of getting back to Cape Evans or anywhere in the Sound. We are short of coal and held firmly in the ice. I hope she drifts quickly to the northeast. Then we can endeavour to push through the pack and make for New Zealand, coal, and return to the barrier eastward of Cape Crozier. This could be done, I think, in the early spring, September. We must get back to aid the depot laying next season. A violent blizzard raged on May 10th and 11th. I never remember such windfalls, said Stenhouse. It was difficult to get along the deck. The weather moderated on the 12th, and a survey of the ship's position was possible. We are lying in a field of ice, with our anchors and 75 fathoms of cable on each hanging at the bows. The aftermoorings were frozen into the ice astern of us at Cape Evans. Previous to the date of our leaving our winter berth, 4 small wires had parted. When we broke away the chain, 2 of the heavy 4-inch wires parted close to shore. The other wire went at the butts. The chain and 2 wires are still fast in the ice and will have to be dug out. This morning we cleared the ice around the cables, but had to abandon the heaving in as the steam froze in the return pipes from the windlass exhaust, and the joints had to be broken and the pipe thawed out. Hooke was listening in from 8:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. for the Macquarie Island wireless station, 1,340 miles away, or the Bluff, New Zealand station, 1,860 miles away, but had no luck. The anchors were hove in by dint of much effort on the 13th and 14th, ice forming on the cable as it was hoisted through a hole cut in the floe. Both anchors had broken, so the Aurora had now 1 small catch anchor left aboard. The ship's position on May 14th was approximately 45 miles north, 34 west of Cape Evans. In 1 week we have drifted 45 miles geographical. Most of this distance was covered during the first 2 days of the drift. We appear to be nearly stationary. What movement there is in the ice seems to be to the northwest towards the ice-bound coast. Hands who were after penguins yesterday reported much noise in the ice about 1 mile from the ship. I hope the floe around the ship is large enough to take its own pressure. We cannot expect much pressure from the south, as McMurdo Sound should soon be frozen over and the ice holding. Northeast winds would drive the pack in from the Ross Sea. I hope for the best. Plans for future development are ready, but probably will be checkmated again. I took the anchors aboard. They are of no further use as separate anchors, but they ornament the forecastle, so we put them in their places. The supply of fresh water is a problem. The engineer turns steam from the boiler into the main water tank, starboard, through a pipe leading from the main winch pipe to the tank top. The steam condenses before reaching the tank. I hope freezing does not burst the tank. A large tabular iceberg, carved from the barrier, is silhouetted against the twilight glow in the sky about 10 miles away. The sight of millions of tons of fresh ice is most tantalizing. It would be a week's journey to the berg and back over pack and pressure, and probably we could bring enough ice to last 2 days. The record of the early months of the Aurora's long drift in the Ross Sea is not eventful. The galley condenser was rigged, but the supply of fresh water remained a problem. The men collected fresh fallen snow when possible and hoped to get within reach of fresh ice. Hooke and Ninnis worked hard at the wireless plant with the object of getting into touch with Macquarie Island and possibly sending news of the ship's movements to Cape Evans. They got the wireless motor running and made many adjustments of the instruments and aerials, but their efforts were not successful. Emperor penguins approached the ship occasionally, and the birds were captured whenever possible for the fresh meat they afforded. The Aurora was quite helpless in the grip of the ice, and after the engine room bilges had been thawed and pumped out, the boilers were blown down. The pressure had been raised to 60 pounds, but there was no chance of moving the ship, and the supply of coal was limited. The story of the Aurora's drift during long months can be told briefly by means of extracts from Stenhouse's logs. May 21st. Early this morning there appeared to be movements in the ice. The grating and grinding noise makes one feel the unimportance of men in circumstances like ours. Twilight, towards noon, showed several narrow, open leads about 2 cables from ship and in all directions. Unable to get bearing, but imagine that there is little or no alteration in ship's position, as ship's head is same, and western mountains appear the same. Hope all is well at Cape Evans, and that the other parties have returned safely. Wish we could relieve their anxiety. May 22nd. Obtained good bearings of Beaufort Island, Cape Ross, and Dunlop Island, which put the ship in a position 18 miles south, 75 degrees east, true, from Cape Ross. Since the 14th, when reliable bearings were last obtained, we have drifted northwest by north 7 miles. May 24th. Blizzard from south-southeast continued until 9 p.m., when it moderated, and at 11:45 p.m. wind shifted to northwest, light, with snow. Quite a lot of havoc has been caused during this blow, and the ship has made much northing. In the morning the crack south of the ship opened to about 3 feet. At 2 p.m. felt heavy shock, and the ship heeled to port about 70 degrees. Found ice had cracked from port gangway to northwest, and parted from ship from gangway along to stern. Crack extended from stern to southeast. 7:35 p.m. Ice cracked from port 4 chains in line parallel to previous crack. The ice broke again between the cracks and drifted to northwest for about 10 yards. The ice to southward then commenced to break up, causing heavy strain on ship and setting apparently north in large broken fields. Ship badly jammed in. 9:15 p.m. Ice closed in again round ship. 2 heavy wind squalls with a short interval between, followed by cessation of wind. We are in a labyrinth of large rectangular floes, some with their points pressing heavily against ship, and high pressure ridges. May 25th. In middle watch felt pressure occasionally. Twilight showed a scene of chaos all around. One floe about 3 feet in thickness had upended, driven under ship on port quarter. As far as can be seen there are heavy blocks of ice screwed up on end, and the scene is like a graveyard. I think swell must have come up under ice from seaward, northeast, McMurdo Sound, and broken the ice, which afterwards started to move under the influence of the blizzard. Hardly think swell can come from the Sound, as the cracks were wending from northwest to southeast, and also as the Sound should be getting icebound by now. If swell came from northeast, then there is open water not far away. I should like to know. I believe the Ross Sea is rarely entirely ice-covered. Have bright moonlight now, which accentuates everything, the beauty and loneliness of our surroundings, and uselessness of ourselves while in this prison. So near to Cape Evans, and yet we might as well be anywhere as here. Have made our sledging ration scales, and crew are busy making harness and getting sledging equipment ready for emergencies. Temperature 30 degrees Fahrenheit. May 26th. If the ship is nipped in the ice, the ship's company, 18 hands, will take to 4 sledges with 1 month's rations and make for nearest land. 6 men and 1 sledge will endeavour to make Cape Evans via the western land, Butler Point, Hut Point, etc. The remaining 12 will come along with all possible speed, but no forced marches, killing and depoting penguins and seals for emergency retreats. If the ship remains here and makes no further drift to the north, towards latter end of July, light will be making. The sun returns August 23rd. The sea ice should be fairly safe, and a party of 3, with 1 month's rations, will proceed to Cape Evans. If the ice sets north and takes the ship clear of land, we will proceed to New Zealand, bunker, get extra officer and 4 volunteers, provisions, etc., push south with all speed to the Barrier, put party onto the Barrier, about 2 miles east of Cape Crozier, and land all necessary stores and requirements. The ship will stand off until able to reach Cape Evans. If necessary, party will depot all stores possible at Corner Camp and go on to Cape Evans. If worst has happened, my party will lay out the depot at the Beardmore for Shackleton. If the ship is released from the ice after September, we must endeavour to reach Cape Evans before going north to bunker. We have not enough coal to hang about the Sound for many days. May 28th. By the position obtained by meridian altitude of stars and bearing of Mount Melbourne, we have drifted 36 miles northeast from last bearings taken on 23rd instant. The most of this must have been during the blizzard of the 24th. Mount Melbourne is 111 miles due north of us, and there is some doubt in my mind as to whether the peak which we can see is this mountain. There may be a mirage. In the evening had the football out on the ice by the light of a beautiful moon. The exercise and break from routine are a splendid tonic. Ice noises sent all hands on board. June 1st. Thick, hazy weather. In the afternoon a black streak appeared in the ice, about a cable's length to the westward, and stretching north and south. 8 p.m. The black line widened and showed long lane of open water. Apparently we are fast in a floe which has broken from the main field. With thick weather we are uncertain of our position and drift. It will be interesting to find out what this crack in the ice signifies. I am convinced that there is open water not far distant in the Ross Sea. Tonight Hooke is trying to call up Cape Evans. If the people at the hut have rigged the set which was left there, they will hear all well from the Aurora. I hope they have. Aside, the messages were not received. End of aside. June 8. Made our latitude 75/59 south by altitude of Sirius. This is a very monotonous life, but all hands appear to be happy and contented. Find that we are not too well off for meals, and will have to cut rations a little. Grady is taking exercise now, and should soon be well again. He seems very anxious to get to work again, and is a good man. No wireless calls tonight, as there is a temporary breakdown, condenser jar broken. There is a very faint display of Aurora in the northern sky. It comes and goes almost imperceptibly, a most fascinating sight. The temperature is 20 degrees Fahrenheit. 52 degrees of frost is much too cold to allow one to stand for long. June 11th. Walked over to a very high pressure ridge about a quarter of a mile north-northwest of the ship. In the dim light, walking over the ice is far from being monotonous, as it is almost impossible to see obstacles, such as small snowed-up ridges, which makes us wary and cautious. A dip in the sea would be the grand finale, but there is little risk of this, as the water freezes as soon as a lane opens in the ice. The pressure ridge is about 15 to 20 feet high, for several hundred feet, and the ice all about it is bent up in a most extraordinary manner. At 9 p.m. Hooke called Cape Evans, all well Aurora, etc. 10 p.m. Weather reports for 8 p.m. sent to Wellington, New Zealand, and Melbourne via Macquarie Island. Aside, the dispatch of messages from the Aurora was continued, but it was learned afterwards that none of them had been received by any station. End of aside. June 13th. The temperature in the chart room ranges from 0 to a little above freezing point. This is a very disturbing factor in rates of the chronometers, 5 in number, 3 GMT and 2 CIT, which are kept in cases in a padded box, each case covered by a piece of blanket, and the box covered by a heavy coat. In any enclosed place where people pass their time, the niches and places where no heat penetrates are covered with frozen breath. There will be a big thaw-out when the temperature rises. June 14th. Mount Melbourne is bearing north 14 degrees west. True. Our approximate position is 40 miles east-northeast of Northern Scrolled Ice Tongue. At 9 p.m. Hooke called Cape Evans and sent weather reports to Wellington and Melbourne via Macquarie Island. Hooke and Ninnis on several evenings at about 11 o'clock have heard what happened to be faint messages, but unreadable. He sent word to Macquarie Island of this, in hopes that they would hear and increase the power. June 20. During this last blow with its accompanying drift snow, there has been much leakage of current from the aerial during the sending of reports. This is apparently due to induction caused by the snow accumulating on the insulators aloft, and thus rendering them useless, and probably to increased inductive force of the current in a body of snowdrift. Hooke appears to be somewhat downhearted over it, and, after discussing the matter, gave me a written report on the non-success, up to the present time, of his endeavours to establish communication. He thinks that the proximity of the magnetic pole and Aurora Australis might affect things. The radiation is good and sufficient for normal conditions. His suggestion to lead the down-lead wires out to the head and astern would increase scope, but I cannot countenance it owing to unsettled state of ice and our too lofty poles. June 21st. Blowing gale from southwest throughout day, but for short spell of westerly breeze about 5 p.m. Light drift at frequent intervals, very hazy, and consequently no land in sight during short twilight. Very hard up for mitts and clothing. What little we have on board I have put to one side for the people at the hut. Have given Thompson instructions to turn crew to making pair mitts and helmet out of jaeger fleece for all hands forward. With strict economy we should make things spin out. Cannot help worrying over our people at the hut. Although worrying does no good, one cannot do otherwise in this present impotent state. 11 p.m. Wind howling and whistling through rigging. Outside, in glare of moon, flying drift and expanse of ice field. Desolation. June 22nd. Today the sun has reached the limit of his northern declination, and now he will start to come south. Observed this day as a holiday, and in the evening had hands aft to drink to the health of the king and the expedition. All hands are happy, but miss the others at Cape Evans. I pray to God we may soon be clear of this prison and in a position to help them. We can live now for sunlight and activity. July 1st. The 1st of July. Thank God, the days pass quickly. Through all my waking hours one long thought of the people at Cape Evans, but one must appear to be happy and take interest in the small happenings of shipboard. July 3rd. Rather hazy with very little light. Moderate west-northwest to southwest winds until noon, when wind veered to south and freshened. No apparent change in ship's position. The berg is on the same bearing, 1 point on the port quarter, and apparently the same distance off. Mount Melbourne was hidden behind a bank of clouds. This is our only landmark now, as Franklin Island is towered in perpetual gloom. Although we have had the berg in sight during all the time of our drift from the entrance to McMurdo Sound, we have not yet seen it in a favourable light, and, were it not for its movement, we might mistake it for a tabular island. It will be interesting to view our companion in the returning light, unless we are too close to it. July 5th. Dull, grey day during twilight, with light, variable, westerly breezes. All around hangs a heavy curtain of haze, and, although very light snow is falling, overhead is black and clear with stars shining. As soon as the faint noon light fades away, the heavy low haze intensifies the darkness and makes one thankful that one has a good firm berth in the ice. I don't care to contemplate the scene if the ice should break up at the present time. July 6th. Last night I thought I saw open water in the shape of a long black lane to the southward of the ship, and extending in an easterly and westerly direction, but owing to the haze and light snow I could not be sure. This morning the lane was distinctly visible and appeared to be 200 or 300 yards wide and 2 miles long. At 6 p.m. loud pressure noises would be heard from the direction of the open lane and continued throughout the night. Shortly after 8 o'clock the grinding and hissing spread to our starboard bow, west-southwest, and the vibration caused by the pressure could be felt intermittently on board the ship. The incessant grinding and grating of the ice to the southward, with seething noises as of water rushing under the ship's bottom, and ominous sounds, kept me on the qui-vive all night, and the prospect of a break-up of the ice would have wrecked my nerves had I not had them numbed by previous experiences. July 9th. At noon the sky to the northward had cleared sufficiently to allow of seeing Mount Melbourne, which appears now as a low peak to the northwest. Ship's position is 28 miles north-northeast of Franklin Island. On the port bow and ahead of the ship there are some enormous pressure ridges. They seem to be the result of the recent and present ice movements. Pressure heard from the southward all day. July 13th. At 5 p.m. very heavy pressure was heard on the port beam and bow, south, and very close to the ship. This occurred again at irregular intervals. Quite close to the ship the ice could be seen bending upwards, and occasional jars were felt on board. I am inclined to think that we have set into a cul-de-sac, and that we will now experience the full force of pressure from the south. We have prepared for the worst, and can only hope for the best. A release from the ice with a seaworthy vessel under us. July 18th. This has been a day of events. About 8 a.m. the horizon to the north became clear, and, as the light grew, the more westerly land showed up. This is the first clear day that we have had since the 9th of the month, and we have set a considerable distance to the north-east in the meantime. By meridian altitudes of the stars and bearings of the land, which prove to be Coulman Islands, Mount Murchison, and Mount Melbourne, our position shows 78 miles geographical north-east by north of Franklin Island. During the last 3 days we have drifted 40 miles geographical, so there has been ample reason for all the grinding and growling of pressure lately. The ship endured some severe squeezes this day. July 20th. Shortly before breakfast the raucous voice of the Emperor Penguin was heard, and afterwards 2 were seen some distance from the ship. The nearest mainland, in vicinity of Cape Washington, is 90 miles distant, as also is Coulman Island. Franklin Island is 80 miles southeast by south, and the pack is in motion. This is the Emperor's hatching season, and here we meet them out in the cheerless desert of ice. 10:45 p.m. Heavy pressure around ship. Lanes opened, and ship worked astern about 20 feet. The wires in the ice took the strain, lashings at mizzen chains carried away fair lead bollard on port side of forecastle head. July 21st, 1 a.m. Lanes open to about 40 feet wide. Ship in open pool about 100 feet wide. Heavy pressure in vicinity of ship. Called all hands and cut wires at the forecastle head. Aside, these wires had remained frozen in the ice after the ship broke away from her moorings, and they had served a useful purpose at some times by checking ice movements close to the ship. End of aside. 2 a.m. Ship swung athwart lane as the ice opened, and the floes on the port side pressed her stern round. 11:30 a.m. Pack of killer whales came up in the lane around the ship. Some broke soft ice, about 1 inch thick, and pushed their heads through, rising to 5 or 6 feet perpendicularly out of the water. They were apparently having a look around. It is strange to see killers in this immense field of ice. Open water must be near, I think. 5:15 p.m. New ice of lanes cracked and opened. Floes on port side pushed stern onto ice of floe. Floes then closed in and nipped the ship fore and aft. The rudder was bent over to starboard and smashed. The solid oak and iron went like matchwood. 8 p.m. Moderate south-southwest gale with drift. Much straining of timbers with pressure. 10 p.m. Extra hard nip fore and aft. Ship visibly hogged. Heavy pressure. End of Chapter 16, Part 1. Chapter 16, Part 2 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. South. The story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 16, Part 2. July 22nd. Ship in bad position in newly frozen lane, with bow and stern jammed against heavy floes. Heavy strain with much creaking and groaning. 8 a.m. Called all hands to stations for sledges, and made final preparations for abandoning ship. Allotted special duties to several hands to facilitate quickness in getting clear should ship be crushed. Am afraid the ship's back will be broken if the pressure continues, but cannot relieve her. 2 p.m. Ship lying easier. Poured sulphuric acid on the ice astern in hopes of rotting crack and relieving pressure on stern post, but unsuccessfully. Very heavy pressure on and around ship. Taking strain fore and aft and on starboard quarter. Ship jumping and straining and listing badly. 10 p.m. Ship has crushed her way into new ice on starboard side and slewed aslant lane with stern post clear of land ice. 12 p.m. Ship is in safer position. Lanes opening in every direction. July 23rd. Caught glimpse of Coleman Island through haze. Position of ship south 14 degrees east. True. 80 miles off Coleman Island. Pressure continued intermittently throughout the day and night, with occasional very heavy squeezes to the ship, which made timbers crack and groan. The ship's stern is now in a more or less soft bed, formed of recently frozen ice of about 1 foot in thickness. I thank God that we have been spared through this fearful nightmare. I shall never forget the concertina motions of the ship during yesterday's and Wednesday's fore and aft nips. July 24th. Compared with previous days, this is a quiet one. The lanes have been opening and closing, and occasionally the ship gets a nasty squeeze against the solid floe on our starboard quarter. The more lanes that open the better, as they form springs, when covered with thin ice, which makes to a thickness of 3 or 4 inches in a few hours, between the solid and heavier floes and fields. Surely we have been guided by the hands of Providence to have come in heavy grinding pack for over 200 miles, geographical, skirting the ice-bound western shore, around and to the north of Franklin Island, and now into what appears a clear path to the open sea. In view of our precarious position and the lives of men in jeopardy, I sent this evening an aerogram to His Majesty King George asking for a relief ship. I hope the wireless gets through. I have sent this message after much consideration, and know that in the event of our non-arrival in New Zealand on the specified date, November 1st, a relief ship will be sent to aid the southern party. July 25th. Very heavy pressure about the ship. During the early hours a large field on the port quarter came charging up, and on meeting our floe tossed up a ridge from 10 to 15 feet high. The blocks of ice as they broke off crumbled and piled over each other to the accompaniment of a thunderous roar. Throughout the day the pressure continued, the floes alternately opening and closing, and the ship creaking and groaning during the nips between floes. August 4. For 9 days we have had southerly winds, and the last 4 we have experienced howling blizzards. I am sick of the sound of the infernal wind. Din, 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 and darkness. We should have seen the sun to-day, but a bank of cumulus effectually hid him, although the daylight is a never-ending joy. August 6. The wind moderated towards 6 a.m., and about breakfast time, with a clear atmosphere, the land from near Cape Cotter to Cape Adare was visible. What a day of delights! After 4 days of thick weather, we find ourselves in sight of Cape Adare in a position about 45 miles east of Possession Isles. In this time we've been set 100 miles. Good going. Mount Sabine, the first land seen by us when coming south, lies away to the westward, forming the highest peak, 10,000 feet, of a majestic range of mountains covered in eternal snow. Due west we can see the Possession Islands, lying under the stupendous bluff of Cape Downshire, which shows large patches of black rock. The land slopes down to the northwest of Cape Downshire and rises again into the high peninsula about Cape Adare. We felt excited this morning in anticipation of seeing the sun, which rose about 9:30 local time. It was a glorious, joyful sight. We drank to something, and with very light hearts gave cheers for the sun. August 9. Donnelly got to work on the rudder again. It is a long job, cutting through the iron sheathing plates of the rudder, and not too safe at present, as the ice is treacherous. Hooke says that the conditions are normal now. I wish for his sake that he could get through. He is a good sportsman and keeps on trying, although I am convinced he has little hope with his inadequate aerial. August 10th. The ship's position is lateral 17 degrees 40 minutes south, 40 miles north, 29 degrees east of Cape Adare. The distance drifted from August 2 to 6 was 100 miles, and from the 6th to the 10th, 88 miles. August 12. By observation and bearings of land we are 45 miles northeast of Cape Adare, in lateral 70 degrees 42 seconds south. This position is a little to the eastward of the position on the 10th. The bearings as laid off on a small-scale chart of mnemonic projection are very inaccurate, and here we are handicapped, as our chronometers have lost all regularity. Donnelly and Grade are having quite a job with the iron platings on the rudder, but should finish the cutting tomorrow. A jury rudder is nearly completed. This afternoon we mixed some concrete for the lower part, and had to use boiling water, as the water froze in the mixing. The carpenter has made a good job of the rudder, although he has had to construct it on the quarterdeck in low temperatures and exposed to biting blasts. August 16th. We are backing and filling about 40 miles northeast of Cape Adare. This is where we expected to have made much mileage. However, we cannot grumble and must be patient. There was much mirage to the northward, and from the Crow's Nest a distinct appearance of open water could be seen stretching from north-northwest to northeast. August 17th. A glorious day. Land is distinctly visible, and to the northward the black fringe of water sky over the horizon hangs continuously. Hooke heard Macquarie Island speaking Hobart. The message heard was the finish of the weather reports. We've hopes now of news in the near future. August 23. Saw the land in the vicinity of Cape North. To the south-southwest the white cliffs and peaks of the inland ranges were very distinct, and away in the distance to the southwest could be seen a low stretch of undulating land. At times Mount Sabine was visible through the gloom. The latitude is 69 degrees 44½ minutes south. We are 58 miles north, 40 miles east of Cape North. August 24th. We lifted the rudder out of the ice and placed it clear of the stern, athwart the fore and aft line of the ship. We had quite a job with it, weight 4½ tons, using treble and double sheaved blocks purchase, but with the endless chain tackle from the engine room and plenty of beef and leverage we dragged it clear. All the pintles are gone at the forepart of the rudder. It is a clean break and bears witness to the terrific force exerted on the ship during the nip. I am glad to see the rudder up on the ice and clear of the propeller. The blade itself, which is solid oak and sheathed on 2 sides and after part half-way down with 3/4 inch iron plating, is undamaged, save for the broken pintles. The twisted portion is in the rudder trunk. August 25th, 11 p.m. Hooke has just been in with the good tidings that he has heard Macquarie and the Bluff, New Zealand, sending their weather reports and exchanging signals. Can this mean that they have heard our recent signals and are trying to get us now? Our motor has been out of order. August 26th. The carpenter has finished the jury rudder and is now at work on the lower end of the rudder truck, where the rudder burst into the stern timbers. We are lucky in having this opportunity to repair these minor damages, which might prove serious in a seaway. August 31st, 6:30 a.m. Very loud pressure noises to the southeast. I went aloft after breakfast and had the pleasure of seeing many open lanes in all directions. The lanes of yesterday are frozen over, showing what little chance there is of a general and continued break-up of the ice until the temperature rises. Land was visible, but far too distant for even approximate bearings. The berg still hangs to the northwest of the ship. We seem to have pivoted outwards from the land. We cannot get out of this too quickly, and although everyone has plenty of work and is cheerful, the uselessness of the ship in her present position palls. September 5th. The mizzen wireless mast came down in a raging blizzard today. In the forenoon I managed to crawl to windward on the top of the bridge house, and under the lee of the chart house watched the mast bending over with the wind and swaying like the branch of a tree. But after the aerial had stood throughout the winter, I hardly thought the mast would carry away. Luckily, as it is dangerous to life to be on deck in this weather, food is brought from the galley in relays through blinding drift and over big heaps of snow, no one was about when the mast carried away. September 8th. This is dull, miserable weather. Blow, snow, and calm for an hour or two. Sometimes it blows in this neighbourhood without snow, and sometimes with. This seems to be the only difference. I have 2 patients now, Larkman and Mugridge. Larkman was frostbitten on the great and second toes of the left foot some time ago, and has so far taken little notice of them. Now they are causing him some alarm as gangrene has set in. Mugridge is suffering from an intermittent rash, with red inflamed skin and large, short-lived blisters. I don't know what the deuce it is, but the nearest description to it in a Materia Medica, etc., is pemphigus, so pemphigus it is, and he has been tonicked and massaged. September 9th. This is the first day for a long time that we have registered a minimum temperature above 0 for the 24 hours. It is pleasant to think that from noon to noon throughout the night the temperature never fell below +4 degrees, 28 degrees frost, and with the increase of daylight it makes one feel that summer really is approaching. September 13th. All around the northern horizon there is the appearance of an open water sky, but around the ship the prospect is dreary. The sun rose at 6:20 a.m. and set at 5:25 p.m. Ship's time 11 hours 5 minutes of sunlight and 17 hours light, 3 hours twilight morning and evening. The carpenter is dismantling the taffrail, to facilitate the landing and, if necessary, the boarding of the jury rudder, and will construct a temporary removable rail. September 16th. There has been much mirage all around the horizon, and to the eastward through south to southwest heavy frost smoke has been rising. Over the northern horizon a low bank of white fog hangs as though over the sea. I do not like these continued low temperatures. I am beginning to have doubts as to our release, until the sun starts to rot the ice. September 17th. This is the anniversary of our departure from London. There are only 4 of the original 11 on board. Larkman, Ninnis, Mauger and I. Much has happened since Friday, September 18, 1914, and I can recall the scene as we passed down the Thames with submarines and cruisers in commission and bent on business crossing our course. I can also remember the regret at leaving it all and the consequent fed-upness. September 21st. The sun is making rapid progress south, and we have had today over 17 hours light and 12 hours sunlight. Oh, for a release! The monotony and worry of our helpless position is deadly. I suppose Shackleton and his party will have started depot laying now, and will be full of hopes for the future. I wonder whether the Endurance wintered in the ice or went north. I cannot help thinking that if she wintered in the Weddell Sea she will be worse off than the Aurora. What a lot we have to look for in the next 6 months. News of Shackleton and the Endurance, the party at Cape Evans, and the war. September 22nd. Latitude 69 degrees 12 minutes south, longitude 165 degrees 0 minutes east. Sturge Island, Balleny Group, is bearing north, true 90 miles distant. light northwest airs with clear, fine weather. Sighted Sturge Island in the morning, bearing due north of us and appearing like a faint low shadow on the horizon. It is good to get a good landmark for fixing positions again, and it is good to see that we are making northerly progress, however small. Since breaking away from Cape Evans, we have drifted roughly 750 miles around islands and past formidable obstacles, a wonderful drift. It is good to think that it has not been in vain, and that the knowledge of the set and drill of the pack will be a valuable addition to the sum of human knowledge. The distance from Cape Evans to our present position is 705 miles, geographical. September 27th. The temperature in my room last night was round about 0, rather chilly, but warm enough under the blankets. Hooke has dismantled his wireless gear. He feels rather sick about not getting communication, although he does not show it. September 30th. Ninnis has been busy now for the week on the construction of a new tractor. He's building the body and will assemble the motor in the 4 tween decks, where it can be lashed securely when we are released from the ice. I can see leads of open water from the masthead, but we are still held firmly. How long? October 7th. As time wears on, the possibility of getting back to the Barrier to land a party deserves consideration. If we do not get clear until late in the season, we will have to turn south first, although we have no anchors and little moorings, no rudder and a short supply of coal. To leave a party on the Barrier would make us very short-handed. Still, it can be done, and anything is preferable to the delay in assisting the people at Cape Evans. At 5 a.m. a beautiful parhelion formed around the sun. The sight so impressed the boatswain that he roused me out to see it. During the month of October the Aurora drifted uneventfully. Stenhouse mentions that there was often an appearance of open water on the northern and eastern horizon, but anxious eyes were strained in vain for indications that the day of the ship's release was near at hand. Hooke had the wireless plant running again and was trying daily to get into touch with Macquarie Island, now about 850 miles distant. The request for a relief ship was to be renewed if communication could be established, for by this time, if all had gone well with the Endurance, the overland party from the Weddell Sea would have been starting. There was considerable movement of the ice towards the end of the month, lanes opening and closing, but the floe, some acres in area, into which the Aurora was frozen, remained firm until the early days of November. The cracks appeared close to the ship, due apparently to heavy drift causing the floe to sink. The temperatures were higher now, under the influence of the sun, and the ice was softer. Thawing was causing discomfort in the quarters aboard. The position on November 12th was reckoned to be latitude 66 degrees 49 minutes south, longitude 155 degrees 17 minutes 45 seconds east. Stenhouse made a sounding on November 17th in latitude 66 degrees 40 minutes south, longitude 154 degrees 45 minutes east, and found bottom at 194 fathoms. The bottom sample was mud and a few small stones. The sounding line showed a fairly strong undercurrent to the northwest. We panned out some of the mud, says Stenhouse, and in the remaining grid found several specks of gold. 2 days later the trend of the current was southeasterly. There was a pronounced thaw on the 22nd. The cabins were in a dripping state, and recently falling snow was running off the ship in little streams. All hands were delighted, for the present discomfort offered promise of an early break-up of the pack. November 23rd. At 3 a.m. Young Island, Balleny Group, was seen bearing north 54 degrees east, true. The island, which showed up clearly on the horizon under a heavy stratus-covered sky, appeared to be very far distant. By latitude at noon we are in 66 degrees 26 minutes south. As this is the charted latitude of Peak Foreman, Young Island, the bearing does not agree. Land was seen at 8 a.m. bearing south 60 degrees west, true. This, which would appear to be Cape Hudson, loomed up through the mists in the form of a high, bold headland, with low undulating land stretching away to the south-southeast and to the westward of it. The appearance of this headland has been foretold for the last 2 days by masses of black fog, but it seems strange that land so high should not have been seen before, as there is little change in the atmospheric conditions. November 24th. Overcast and hazy during forenoon. Cloudy, clear and fine in afternoon and evening. Not a vestige of land can be seen, so Cape Hudson is really Cape Flyaway. This is most weird. All hands saw the headland to the southwest, and some of us sketched it. Now, afternoon, although the sky is beautifully clear to the southwest, nothing can be seen. We cannot have drifted far from yesterday's position. No wonder Wilkes reported land. 9 p.m. A low fringe of land appears on the horizon bearing southwest, but in no way resembles our cape of yesterday. This afternoon we took a cast of the lead through the crack 200 yards west of the ship, but found no bottom at 700 fathoms. An interesting incident on November 26th was the discovery of an emperor penguin rookery. Ninnis and Kavanagh took a long walk to the northwest and found the deserted rookery. The depressions in the ice made by the birds were about 18 inches long and contained a greyish residue. The rookery was in a hollow surrounded by pressure ridges 6 feet high. Apparently about 20 birds had been there. No pieces of eggshell were seen, but the petrels and skuas had been there in force and probably would have taken all scraps of this kind. The floes were becoming soft and rotten, and walking was increasingly difficult. Deep pools of slush and water covered with thin snow made traps for the men. Stenhouse thought that a stiff blizzard would break up the pack. His anxiety was increasing with the advance of the season, and his log is a record of deep yearning to be free and active again. But the grip of the pack was inexorable. The hands had plenty of work on the Aurora, which was being made shipshape after the buffeting of the winter storms. Seals and penguins were seen frequently, and the supply of fresh meat was maintained. The jury rudder was ready to be shipped when the ship was released, but in the meantime it was not being exposed to the attacks of the ice. No appreciable change in our surroundings, was the note for December 17. Every day past now reduces our chance of getting out in time to go north for rudder, anchors and coal. If we break out before January 15th, we might get north to New Zealand and down to Cape Evans again in time to pick up the parties. After that date we can only attempt to go south in our crippled state, and short of fuel. With only 9 days' coal on board, we would have little chance of working through any Ross Sea pack, or of getting south at all if we encountered many blizzards. Still, there is a sporting chance, and luck may be with us. Shackleton may be past the Pole now. I wish our wireless calls had got through. Christmas Day, with its special dinner and mild festivities, came and passed, and still the ice remained firm. The men were finding some interest in watching the moulting of emperor penguins, who were stationed at various points in the neighbourhood of the ship. They had taken station to leeward of hummocks, and appeared to move only when the wind changed or the snow around them had become foul. They covered but a few yards on these journeys, and even then stumbled in their weakness. One emperor was brought on board alive, and the crew were greatly amused to see the bird balancing himself on heels and tail with upturned toes, the position adopted when the egg is resting on the feet during the incubation period. The threat of a stiff blow aroused hopes of release several times, but a blizzard, probably the first Antarctic blizzard that was ever longed for, did not arrive. New Year's Day found Stenhouse and other men just recovering from an attack of snow blindness, contracted by making an excursion across the floes without snow goggles. At the end of the first week in January, the ship was in latitude 65 degrees 45 minutes south. The pack was well broken a mile from the ship, and the ice was rolling fast. Under the bows and stern the pools were growing and stretching away in long lanes to the west. A seal came up to blow under the stern on the 6th, proving that there was an opening in the sunken ice there. Stenhouse was economizing in food. No breakfast was served on the ship, and seal or penguin meat was used for at least one of the 2 meals later in the day. All hands were short of clothing, but Stenhouse was keeping intact the sledging gear intended for the use of the shore party. Strong variable winds on the 9th raised hopes again, and on the morning of the 10th the ice appeared to be well broken from half a mile to a mile distant from the ship in all directions. It seems extraordinary that the ship should be held in an almost unbroken floe of about a mile square, the more so as this patch was completely screwed and broken during the smash in July, and contains many faults. In almost any direction at a distance of half a mile from the ship there are pressure ridges of 8-inch ice piled 20 feet high. It was provident that although so near these ridges were escaped. The middle of January was past, and the Aurora lay still in the ice. The period of continuous day was drawing towards its close, and there was an appreciable twilight at midnight. A dark water sky could be seen on the northern horizon. The latitude on January 24th was 65 degrees 39½ minutes south. Towards the end of the month, Stenhouse ordered a thorough overhaul of the stores and general preparations for a move. The supply of flour and butter was ample. Other stores were running low, and the crew lost no opportunity of capturing seals and penguins. Adelies were travelling to the east-southeast in considerable numbers, but they could not be taken unless they approached the ship closely, owing to the soft condition of the ice. The wireless plant, which had been idle during the month of daylight, had been rigged again, and Hooke resumed his course to Macquarie Island on February 2nd. He listened in vain for any indication that he had been heard. The pack was showing much movement, but the large floe containing the ship remained firm. The break-up of the floe came on February 12th. Strong northeast to southeast winds put the ice in motion and brought a perceptible swell. The ship was making some water, a foretaste of a trouble to come, and all hands spent the day at the pumps, reducing the water from 3 feet 8½ inches in the well to 12 inches, in spite of frozen pipes and other difficulties. Work had just finished for the night when the ice broke astern and quickly split in all directions under the influence of the swell. The men managed to save some seal meat which had been cached in a drift near the gangway. They lost the flagstaff, which had been rigged as a wireless mast out on the floe, but drew in the aerial. The ship was floating now amidst fragments of floe and bumping considerably in the swell. A fresh southerly wind blew during the night, and the ship started to forge ahead gradually without sail. At 8:30 a.m. on the 13th, Stenhouse set the foresail and foretopmast staysail, and the Aurora moved northward slowly, being brought up occasionally by large floes. Navigation under such conditions, without steam and without a rudder, was exceedingly difficult, but Stenhouse wished if possible to save his small remaining stock of coal until he cleared the pack, so that a quick run might be made to McMurdo Sound. The jury rudder could not be rigged in the pack. The ship was making about 3½ feet of water in the 24 hours, a quantity easily kept in check by the pumps. During the 14th, the Aurora worked very slowly northward through heavy pack. Occasionally the yards were backed or an ice anchor put into a floe to help her out of difficult places, but much of the time she steered herself. The jury rudder boom was topped into position in the afternoon, but the rudder was not to be shipped until open pack or open water was reached. The ship was held up all day on the 15th in latitude 64 degrees 38 minutes south. Heavy floes barred progress in every direction. Attempts were made to work the ship by trimming sails and warping with ice anchors, but she could not be manoeuvred smartly enough to take advantage of leads that opened and closed. This state of affairs continued throughout the 16th. That night a heavy swell was rolling under the ice, and the ship had a rough time. One pointed floe 10 or 12 feet thick was steadily battering, with a 3 feet send, against the starboard side, and fenders only partially deadened the shock. "It is no use butting against this pack with steam power," wrote Stenhouse. "We would use all our meagre supply of coal in reaching the limit of the ice in sight, and then we would be in a hole, with neither ballast nor fuel. But if the stagnation lasts another week, we will have to raise steam and consume our coal in an endeavour to get into navigable waters. I am afraid our chances of getting south are very small now." The pack remained close, and on the 21st a heavy swell made the situation dangerous. The ship bumped heavily that night, and fenders were of little avail. With each send of the swell the ship would bang her bows on the floe ahead, then bounce back and smash into another floe across her stern post. This floe, about 6 feet thick and 100 feet across, was eventually split and smashed by the impacts. The pack was jammed close on the 23rd, when the noon latitude was 64 degrees 36½ minutes south. The next change was for the worse. The pack loosened on the night of the 25th, and a heavy northwest swell caused the ship to bump heavily. This state of affairs recurred at intervals in succeeding days. The battering and ramming of the floes increased in the early hours of February 29th, until it seemed as if some sharp floe or jagged underfoot must go through the ship's hull. At 6 a.m. we converted a large coir spring into a fender and slipped it under the port quarter, where a pressured floe with 20 to 30 feet underfoot was threatening to knock the propeller and sternpost off altogether. At 9 a.m., after pumping ship, the engineer reported a leak in the way of the propeller shaft aft near the sternpost on the port side. The carpenter cut part of the lining and filled the space between the timbers with Stockholm tar, cement, and oakum. He could not get at the actual leak, but his makeshift made a little difference. I'm anxious about the propeller. This pack is a dangerous place for a ship now. It seems miraculous that the old barkie still floats. The ice opened out a little on March 1st. It was imperative to get the ship out of her dangerous situation quickly, as winter was approaching, and Stenhouse therefore ordered steam to be raised. Next morning he had the spanker gaff rigged over the stern for use as a temporary rudder while in the heavy pack. Steam had been raised to working pressure at 5:15 p.m. on the 2nd, and the Aurora began to work ahead to the westward. Progress was very slow owing to heavy floes and deep underfoots, which necessitated frequent stoppages of the engines. Open water was in sight to the north and northwest the next morning after a restless night spent among the rocking floes, but progress was very slow. The Aurora went to leeward under the influence of a west-southwest breeze, and steering by means of the yards and a warp anchor was a ticklish business. The ship came to a full stop among heavy floes before noon on the 3rd, and 3 hours later, after vain attempts to warp ahead by means of ice anchors, Stenhouse had the fires partially drawn, to save coal, and banked. No advance was made on March 4th and 5th. A moderate gale from the east-northeast closed the ice and set it in motion, and the Aurora, with banked fires, rolled and bumped heavily. 17 bergs were in sight, and one of them was working southwards into the pack and threatening to approach the ship. During the night the engines were turned repeatedly by the action of ice on the propeller blades. All theories about the swell being non-existent in the pack are false, wrote the anxious master. Here we are with a suggestion only of open water sky, and the ship rolling her scuppers under and sitting down bodily on the floes. The ice opened when the wind moderated, and on the afternoon of the 6th the Aurora moved northward again. Without a rudder (no jury rudder can yet be used among these swirling, rolling floes), the ship requires a lot of attention. Her head must be pointed between floes by means of ice anchors and warps, or by mooring to a floe and steaming round it. We kept a fairly good course between 2 bergs to our northward, and made about 5 miles northing till, darkness coming on, the men could no longer venture on the floes with safety to fix the anchors. The next 3 days were full of anxiety. The Aurora was held by the ice, and subjected to severe buffeting, while 2 bergs approached from the north. On the morning of the 10th, the nearest berg was within 3 cables of the ship. But the pack had opened, and by 9:30 a.m. the ship was out of the danger zone and headed north-northeast. The pack continued to open during the afternoon, and the Aurora passed through wide stretches of small loose floes and brash. Progress was good until darkness made a stop necessary. The next morning the pack was denser. Stenhouse shipped a preventer jury rudder, the weighted spanker gaff, but could not get steerage way. Broad leads were sighted to the northwest in the afternoon, and the ship got within a quarter of a mile of the nearest lead before being held up by heavy pack. She again bumped severely during the night, and the watch stood by with fenders to ease the more dangerous blows. Early next morning Stenhouse lowered a jury rudder, with steering pennants to drag through the water, and moved north to northwest through heavy pack. He made 60 miles that day on an erratic course, and then spent an anxious night with the ship setting back into the pack and being pounded heavily. Attempts to work forward to an open lead on the morning of the 13th were unsuccessful. Early in the afternoon a little progress was made, with all hands standing by to fend off high ice, and at 4:50 p.m. the Aurora cleared the main pack. An hour was spent shipping the jury rudder under the counter, and then the ship moved slowly northward. There was pack still ahead, and the bergs and growlers were a constant menace in the hours of darkness. Some anxious work remained to be done, since bergs and scattered ice extended in all directions, but at 2 p.m. on March 14th the Aurora cleared the last belt of pack in latitude 62 degrees 27½ minutes south, longitude 157 degrees 32 minutes east. "We spliced the main brace," says Stenhouse, and blew 3 blasts of farewell to the pack with the whistle. The Aurora was not at the end of her troubles, but the voyage up to New Zealand need not be described in detail. Any attempt to reach McMurdo Sound was now out of the question. Stenhouse had a battered, rudderless ship with only a few tons of coal left in the bunkers, and he struggled northward in heavy weather against persistent adverse winds and head seas. The jury rudder needed constant nursing, and the shortage of coal made it impossible to get the best service from the engines. There were times when the ship could make no progress and fell about helplessly in a confused swell, or lay hove to amid mountainous seas. She was short-handed, and 1 or 2 of the men were creating additional difficulties. But Stenhouse displayed throughout fine seamanship and dogged perseverance. He accomplished successfully one of the most difficult voyages on record, in an ocean area notoriously stormy and treacherous. On March 23rd he established wireless communication with Bluff Station, New Zealand, and the next day was in touch with Wellington and Hobart. The naval officer in New Zealand waters offered assistance, and eventually it was arranged that the Otago Harbour boat's tug Plucky should meet the Aurora outside Port Chalmers. There were still bad days to be endured. The jury rudder partially carried away and had to be unshipped in a heavy sea. Stenhouse carried on, and in the early morning of April 2nd the Aurora picked up the tug and was taken in tow. She reached Port Chalmers the following morning and was welcomed with the warm hospitality that New Zealand has always shown towards Antarctic explorers. End of Chapter 16, Part 2.
Chapter 17 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. South. The story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917. By Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 17. The Last Relief. When I reached New Zealand at the beginning of December 1916, I found that the arrangements for the relief were complete. The New Zealand government had taken the task in hand earlier in the year, before I had got into touch with the outside world. The British and Australian governments were giving financial assistance. The Aurora had been repaired and refitted at Port Chalmers during the year at considerable cost, and had been provisioned and coaled for the voyage to McMurdo Sound. My old friend Captain John K. Davis, who was a member of my first Antarctic expedition in 1907 to 1909, and who subsequently commanded Dr. Mawson's ship in the Australian Antarctic expedition, had been placed in command of the Aurora by the governments, and he had engaged officers, engineers and crew. Captain Davis came to Wellington to see me on my arrival there, and I heard his account of the position. I had interviews also with the Minister for Marine, the late Dr. Robert McNabb, a kindly and sympathetic Scotsman who took a deep personal interest in the expedition. Stenhouse also was in Wellington, and I may say again here that his account of his voyage and drift in the Aurora filled me with admiration for his pluck, seamanship and resourcefulness. After discussing the situation fully with Dr. McNabb, I agreed that the arrangements already made for the relief expedition should stand. Time was important, and there were difficulties about making any change of plans or control at the last moment. After Captain Davis had been at work for some months, the government agreed to hand the Aurora over to me, free of liability on her return to New Zealand. It was decided, therefore, that Captain Davis should take the ship down to McMurdo Sound, and I should go with him to take charge of any shore operations that might be necessary. I signed on at a salary of 1 shilling a month, and we sailed from Port Chalmers on December 20th, 1916. A week later we sighted ice again. The Aurora made a fairly quick passage through this pack, and entered the open water of the Weddell Sea on January 7th, 1917. Captain Davis brought the Aurora alongside the ice edge off Cape Royds on the morning of January 10th, and I went ashore with the party to look for some record in the hut erected there by my expedition in 1907. I found a letter stating that the Ross Sea party was housed at Cape Evans, and was on my way back to the ship when 6 men with dogs and sledge were sighted coming from the direction of Cape Evans. At 1 p.m. this party arrived on board, and we learned that of the 10 members of the expedition left behind when the Aurora broke away on May 6, 1915, 7 had survived, namely A. Stevens, E. Joyce, H. E. Wild, J. L. Cope, R. W. Richards, A. K. Jack, I. O. Gaze. These 7 men were all well, though they showed traces of the ordeal through which they had passed. They told us of the deaths of Mackintosh, Spencer Smith, and Hayward, and of their own anxious wait for relief. All that remained to be done was to make a final search for the bodies of Mackintosh and Hayward. There was no possibility of either man being alive. They had been without equipment when the blizzard broke the ice they were crossing. It would have been impossible for them to have survived more than a few days, and 8 months had now elapsed without news of them. Joyce had already searched south of Glacier Tongue. I considered that further search should be made in 2 directions, the area north of Glacier Tongue and the old depot off Butler Point, and I made a report to Captain Davis to this effect. On January 12th, the ship reached a point 5½ miles of Butler Point. I took a party across rubbly and waterlogged ice to within 30 yards of the Piedmont ice, but owing to high cliffs and loose slushy ice, could not make a landing. The land ice had broken away at the point cut by the cross bearings of the depot, but was visible in the form of 2 large bergs grounded to the north of Cape Bernacchi. There was no sign of the depot, or of any person having visited the vicinity. We returned to the ship and proceeded across the sound to Cape Bernacchi. The next day I took a party ashore with the object of searching the area north of Glacier Tongue, including Razorback Island, for traces of the 2 missing men. We reached Cape Evans hut at 1:30 p.m. and Joyce and I left at 3 p.m. for the Razorbacks. We conducted a search round both islands, returning to the hut at 7 p.m. The search had been fruitless. On the 14th I started with Joyce to search the north side of Glacier Tongue, but the surface drift, with wind from southeast, decided me not to continue, as the ice was moving rapidly at the end of Cape Evans, and the pool between the hut and Inaccessible Island was growing larger. The wind increased in the afternoon. The next day a southeast blizzard was blowing, with drift half up the islands. I considered it unsafe to sledge that day, especially as the ice was breaking away from the south side of Cape Evans into the pool. We spent the day putting the hut in order. We got up at 3 a.m. on the 16th. The weather was fine and calm. I started at 4:20 with Joyce to the south at the greatest possible speed. We reached Glacier Tongue about 1½ miles from the seaward end. Wherever there were not precipitous cliffs, there was an even snow slope to the top. From the top we searched with glasses. There was nothing to be seen but blue ice, creviced, showing no protuberances. We came down and, half running, half walking, worked about 3 miles towards the root of the glacier, but I could see there was not the slightest chance of finding any remains, owing to the enormous snowdrifts wherever the cliffs were accessible. The base of the steep cliffs had drifts 10 to 15 feet high. We arrived back at the hut at 9:40 and left almost immediately for the ship. I considered that all places likely to hold the bodies of Mackintosh and Hayward had now been searched. There was no doubt to my mind that they met their deaths on the breaking of the thin ice when the blizzard arose on May 8, 1916. During my absence from the hut, Wild and Jack had erected a cross to the memory of the 3 men who had lost their lives in the services of the expedition. Captain Davis took the ship northward on January the 17th. The ice conditions were unfavourable and pack barred the way. We stood over the western coast towards Dunlop Island and followed it to Granite Harbour. No mark or depot of any kind was seen. The Aurora reached the main pack, about 60 miles from Cape Adare, on January 22nd. The ice was close ahead, and Davis went south in open water to wait for better conditions. A northwest gale on January 28th enabled the ship to pass between the pack and the land off Cape Adare, and we crossed the Antarctic Circle on the last day of the month. On February 4th, Davis sent a formal report to the New Zealand government by wireless, and on February 9th the Aurora was berthed in Wellington. We were welcomed like returned brothers by the New Zealand people. End of chapter 17. Recorded by Gesine in September 2007. Chapter 18 of South. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. South. The Story of Shackleton's Last Expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 18. The Final Phase. The foregoing chapters of this book represent the general narrative of our expedition. That we failed in accomplishing the object we set out for was due, I venture to assert, not to any neglect or lack of organization, but to the overwhelming natural obstacles, especially the unprecedentedly severe summer conditions on the Weddell Sea side. But though the expedition was a failure in one respect, I think it was successful in many others. A large amount of important scientific work was carried out. The meteorological observations in particular have an economic bearing. The hydrographical work in the Weddell Sea has done much to clear up the mystery of this, the least known of all the seas. I have appended a short scientific memorandum to this volume, but the more detailed scientific results must wait until a more suitable time arrives, when more stable conditions prevail. Then results will be worked out. To the credit side of the expedition, one can safely say that the comradeship and resource of the members of the expedition was worthy of the highest traditions of polar service, and it was a privilege to me to have had under my command men who, through dark days and the stress and strain of continuous danger, kept up their spirits and carried out their work regardless of themselves and heedless of the limelight. The same energy and endurance that they showed in the Antarctic they brought to the greater war in the Old World. And having followed our fortunes in the South, you may be interested to know that practically every member of the expedition was employed in one or other branches of the active fighting forces during the war. Several are still abroad, and for this very reason it has been impossible for me to obtain certain details for this book. Of the 53 men who returned out of the 56 who left for the South, 3 have since been killed and 5 wounded. 4 decorations have been won, and several members of the expedition have been mentioned in dispatches. McCarthy, the best and most efficient of the sailors, always cheerful under the most trying circumstances, and who for these very reasons I chose to accompany me on the boat journey to South Georgia, was killed at his gun in the Channel. Cheetham, the veteran of the Antarctic, who had been more often south of the Antarctic Circle than any man, was drowned when the vessel he was serving in was torpedoed a few weeks before the armistice. Ernest Wild, Frank Wild's brother, was killed while minesweeping in the Mediterranean. Mauger, the carpenter on the Aurora, was badly wounded while serving with the New Zealand infantry, so that he is unable to follow his trade again. He is now employed by the New Zealand government. The 2 surgeons, Macklin and McIlroy, served in France and Italy, McIlroy being badly wounded at Ypres. Frank Wild, in view of his unique experience of ice and ice conditions, was at once sent to the North Russian front, where his zeal and ability won him the highest praise. Macklin served first with the Yorks and later transferred as medical officer to the tanks, where he did much good work. Going to the Italian front with his battalion, he won the Military Cross for bravery in tending wounded under fire. James joined the Royal Engineers sound ranging section, and after much front-line work was given charge of a sound ranging school to teach other officers this latest and most scientific addition to the art of war. Wordy went to France with the Royal Field Artillery and was badly wounded at Armentières. Hussey was in France for 18 months with the Royal Garrison Artillery, serving in each big battle from Dixmude to Saint-Quentin. Worsley, known to his intimates as Depth Charge Bill, owing to his success with that particular method of destroying German submarines, has the Distinguished Service Order and 3 submarines to his credit. Stenhouse, who commanded the Aurora after Mackintosh landed, was with Worsley as his second in command when one of the German submarines was rammed and sunk, and received the DSC for his share in the fight. He was afterwards given command of a mystery ship and fought several actions with enemy submarines. Clark served on a minesweeper. Greenstreet was employed with the barges on the Tigris. Rickenson was commissioned as engineer lieutenant. R.N. Kerr returned to the merchant service as an engineer. Most of the crew of the Endurance served on minesweepers. Of the Ross Sea party, Mackintosh, Hayward, and Spencer Smith died for their country as surely as any who gave up their lives in the fields of France and Flanders. Hook, the wireless operator, now navigates an airship. Nearly all of the crew of the Aurora joined the New Zealand Field Forces and saw active service in one or other of the many theatres of war. Several have been wounded, but it has been impossible to obtain details. On my return, after the rescue of the survivors of the Ross Sea party, I offered my services to the government and was sent on a mission to South America. When this was concluded, I was commissioned as major and went to North Russia, in charge of Arctic equipment and transport, having with me Worsley, Stenhouse, Hussey, Macklin, and Brocklehurst, who was to have come south with us, but who, as a regular officer, rejoined his unit on the outbreak of war. He has been wounded 3 times and was in the retreat from Mons. Worsley was sent across to the Archangel front, where he did excellent work, and the others served with me on the Murmansk front. The mobile columns there had exactly the same clothing, equipment, and sledging food as we had on the expedition. No expense was spared to obtain the best of everything for them, and as a result not a single case of avoidable frostbite was reported. Taking the expedition as a unit, out of 56 men, 3 died in the Antarctic, 3 were killed in action, and 5 have been wounded, so that our casualties have been fairly high. Though some have gone, there are enough left to rally round and form a nucleus for the next expedition, when troublous times are over and scientific exploration can once more be legitimately undertaken. End of chapter 18, and end of South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Note that there are recordings for the 2 appendices of this book. Recorded by Gazini in September 2007.
Section 33 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Appendix I. Scientific Work, by J. M. Wardy, M.A., Cantab, Lieutenant, R.F.A. The research undertaken by the expedition was originally planned for a shore party working from a fixed base on land, but it was only in South Georgia that this condition of affairs was fully realized. On this island, where a full month was spent, the geologist made very extensive collections, and began the mapping of the country. The magnetician had some of his instruments in working order for a short while, and the meteorologist was able to cooperate with the Argentine observer stationed at Grytviken. It had been realized how important the meteorological observations were going to be to the Argentine government, and they accordingly did all in their power to help, both before and at the end of the expedition. The biologist devoted most of his time, meanwhile, to the whaling industry, there being no less than 7 stations on the island. He also made collections of the neritic fauna, and accompanied by the photographer, studied the bird life and the habits of the sea elephants along the east coast. By the time the actual southern voyage commenced, each individual had his own particular line of work which he was prepared to follow out. The biologist at first confined himself to collecting the plankton, and a start was made in securing water samples for temperature and salinity. In this, from the beginning, he had the help of the geologist, who also gave instructions for the taking of a line of soundings under the charge of the ship's officers. This period of the southward voyage was a very busy time so far as the scientists were concerned, for, besides their own particular work, they took the full share of looking after the dogs and working the ship watch by watch. At the same time, moreover, the biologist had to try and avoid being too lavish with his preserving material at the expense of the shore station collections which were yet to make. When it was finally known that the ship had no longer any chance of getting free of the ice in the 1914-1915 season, a radical change was made in the arrangements. The scientists were freed as far as possible from ship's duties, and were thus able to devote themselves almost entirely to their own particular spheres. The meteorological investigations took on a more definite shape. The instruments intended for the land base were set up on board ship, including self-recording barographs, thermometers, and a Dines anemometer, with which very satisfactory results were got. The physicist set up his quadrant electrometer after a good deal of trouble, but throughout the winter had to struggle constantly with rime forming on the parts of his apparatus exposed to the outer air. Good runs were being thus continually spoilt. The determination of the magnetic constants also took up a good part of his time. Besides collecting plankton, the biologist was now able to put down one or other of his dredges at more frequent intervals, always taking care, however, not to exhaust his store of preserving material, which was limited. The taking of water samples was established on a better system, so that the series should be about equally spaced out over the ship's course. The geologist suppressed all thought of rocks, though occasionally they were met with in bottom samples. His work became almost entirely oceanographical, and included a study of the sea ice, of the physiography of the sea floor as shown by daily soundings, and of the bottom deposits. Besides this, he helped the biologist in the temperature and salinity observations. The work undertaken and accomplished by each member was as wide as possible, but it was only in keeping with the spirit of the times that more attention should be paid to work from which practical and economic results were likely to accrue. The meteorologist had always in view the effect of Antarctic climate on the other southern continents. The geologist looked on ice from a seaman's point of view, and the biologist not unwillingly put whales in the forefront of his program. The accounts which follow on these very practical points show how closely scientific work in the Antarctic is in touch with and helps on the economic development of the inhabited lands to the north. Sea Ice Nomenclature by J. M. Wardy, M.A., Cantab, Lieutenant, R.F.A. During the voyage of the Endurance, it was soon noticed that the terms being used to describe different forms of ice were not always in agreement with those given in Markham and Mill's glossary in the Antarctic Manual, 1901. It was the custom, of course, to follow implicitly the terminology used by those of the party whose experience of ice dated back to Captain Scott's first voyage, so that the terms used may be said to be common to all Antarctic voyages of the present century. The principal changes, therefore, in nomenclature must date from the last quarter of the 19th century, when there was no one to pass on the traditional usage from the last naval Arctic expedition in 1875 to the Discovery expedition of 1901. On the latter ship, Markham's and Mill's glossary was, of course, used, but apparently not slavishly, founded as far as sea ice went on Scoresbys made in 1820. It might have been adopted in its entirety, for no writer could have carried more weight than Scoresby the younger, combining as he did more than 10 years' whaling experience with high scientific attainments. Above all others, he could be accepted both by practical seamen and also by students of ice forms. That the old terms of Scoresby did not all survive the period of indifference to polar work, in spite of Markham and Mill, is an indication either that their usefulness has ceased or that the original usage has changed once and for all. A restatement of terms is therefore now necessary. Where possible, the actual phrases of Scoresby and of his successors, Markham and Mill, are still used. The principle adopted, however, is to give preference to the words actually used by the polar seamen themselves. The following authorities have been followed as closely as possible. W. Scoresby, Jr., in An Account of the Arctic Regions, 1820, Volume 1, pages 225 through 233 and 238 through 241. C. R. Markham and H. R. Mill in The Antarctic Manual, 1901, pages 14 through 16. J. Payer, New Lands Within the Arctic Circle, 1876, Volume 1, pages 3 through 14. W. S. Bruce, Polar Exploration, in Home University Library, copyright 1911, pages 54 through 71. Reference should also be made to the annual publication of the Danish Meteorological Institute showing the Arctic ice conditions of the previous summer. This is published in both Danish and English, so that the terms used there are bound to have a very wide acceptance. It is hoped, therefore, that they may be the means of preventing the Antarctic terminology following a different line of evolution, for but seldom is a seaman found nowadays who knows both polar regions. On the Danish charts, 6 different kinds of sea ice are marked, namely unbroken polar ice, land floe, great ice fields, tight pack ice, open ice, bay ice, and brash. With the exception of bay ice, which is more generally known as young ice, all these terms pass current in the Antarctic. Slush or sludge. The initial stages in the freezing of seawater, when its consistency becomes gluey or soupy. The term is also used, but not commonly, for brash ice still further broken down. Pancake ice. Small circular floes with raised rims, due to the break-up in a generally ruffled sea of the newly formed ice into pieces which strike against each other and so form turned-up edges. Young ice. Applied to all unhummocked ice up to about a foot in thickness. Owing to the fibrous or platy structure, the floes crack easily, and where the ice is not over thick, a ship under steam cuts a passage without much difficulty. Young ice may originate from the coalescence of pancakes, where the water is slightly ruffled, or else be a sheet of black ice, covered maybe with ice flowers, formed by the freezing of a smooth sheet of seawater. In the Arctic, it has been the custom to call this form of ice bay ice. In the Antarctic, however, the latter term is wrongly used for land floes, fast ice, etc., and has been so misapplied consistently for 15 years. The term bay ice should possibly, therefore, be dropped altogether, especially since, even in the Arctic, its meaning is not altogether a rigid one, as it may denote firstly the gluey slush which forms when seawater freezes, and secondly the firm level sheet ultimately produced. Land floes. Heavy but not necessarily hummocked ice, with generally a deep snow covering, which has remained held up in the position of growth by the enclosing nature of some feature of the coast, or by grounded bergs throughout the summer season when most of the ice breaks out. Its thickness is therefore above the average. Has been called at various times fast ice, coast ice, land ice, bay ice by Shackleton and David and the Charcot expedition, and possibly what Dragowski calls shelf ice is not very different. Floe. An area of ice, level or hummocked, whose limits are within sight. Includes all sizes between brash on the one hand and fields on the other. Light floes are between 1 and 2 feet in thickness, anything thinner being young ice. Those exceeding 2 feet in thickness are termed heavy floes, being generally hummocked, and in the Antarctic, at any rate, covered by fairly deep snow. Field. A sheet of ice of such extent that its limits cannot be seen from the masthead. Hummocking. Includes all the processes of pressure formation whereby level young ice becomes broken up and built up into hummocky floes, the most suitable term for what has also been called old pack and screwed pack by David and Scholleneis by German writers. In contrast to young ice, the structure is no longer fibrous, but becomes spotted or bubbly, a certain percentage of salt drains away, and the ice becomes almost translucent. The pack is a term very often used in a wide sense to include any area of sea ice, no matter what form it takes or how disposed. The French term is banquise de dérive. Pack ice. A more restricted use than the above, to include hummocky floes or close areas of young ice and light floes. Pack ice is close or tight if the floes constituting it are in contact, open if for the most part they do not touch. In both cases it hinders, but does not necessarily check navigation. The contrary holds for drift ice. Loose open ice, where the area of water exceeds that of ice. Generally, drift ice is within reach of the swell, and is a stage in the breaking down of pack ice, the size of the floes being much smaller than in the latter. Scoresby's use of the term drift ice for pieces of ice intermediate in size between floes and brash has, however, quite died out. The Antarctic or Arctic pack usually has a girdle or fringe of drift ice. Brash. Small fragments and roundish nodules, the wreck of other kinds of ice. Bergy bits. Pieces about the size of a cottage of glacier ice or of hummocky pack washed clear of snow. Growlers. Still smaller pieces of sea ice than the above, greenish in color and barely showing above water level. Crack. Any sort of fracture or rift in the sea ice covering. Lead or lane. Where a crack opens out to such a width as to be navigable. In the Antarctic it is customary to speak of these as leads, even when frozen over to constitute areas of young ice. Pools. Any enclosed water areas in the pack where length and breadth are about equal. Meteorology by L. D. A. Hussey, Bachelor of Science, London, Captain, R.G.A. The meteorological results of the expedition, when properly worked out and correlated with those from other stations in the southern hemisphere, will be extremely valuable, both for their bearing on the science of meteorology in general, and for their practical and economic applications. South America is, perhaps, more intimately concerned than any other country, but Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa are all affected by the weather conditions of the Antarctic. Researches are now being carried on which tend to show that the meteorology of the two hemispheres is more interdependent than was hitherto believed, so that a meteorological disturbance in one part of the world makes its presence felt, more or less remotely perhaps, all over the world. It is evident, therefore, that a complete knowledge of the weather conditions in any part of the world, which it is understood carries with it the ability to make correct forecasts, can never be obtained unless the weather conditions in every other part are known. This makes the need for purely scientific polar expeditions so imperative, since our present knowledge of Arctic and Antarctic meteorology is very meager, and to a certain extent unsystematic. What is wanted is a chain of observing stations, well equipped with instruments and trained observers, stretching across the Antarctic continent. A series of exploring ships could supplement these observations with others made by them while cruising in the Antarctic seas. It would pay to do this, even for the benefit accruing to farmers, sailors, and others who are so dependent on the weather. As an instance of the value of a knowledge of Antarctic weather conditions, it may be mentioned that, as the result of observations and researches carried out at the South Orkneys, a group of sub-Antarctic islands at the entrance to the Weddell Sea, it has been found that a cold winter in that sea is a sure precursor of a drought over the maize and cereal-bearing area of Argentina 3.5 years later. To the farmers, the value of this knowledge so far in advance is enormous, and since England has some £300 million invested in Argentine interest, Antarctic expeditions have proved and will prove their worth even from a purely commercial point of view. I have given just this one instance to satisfy those who question the utility of polar expeditions, but many more could be cited. As soon as it was apparent that no landing could be made, and that we should have to spend a winter in the ship drifting round with the pack, instruments were set up and observations taken just as if we had been ashore. A meteorological screen or box was erected on a platform over the stern, right away from the living quarters, and in it were placed the maximum and minimum thermometers, the recording barograph and the thermograph, an instrument which writes every variation of the temperature and pressure on a sheet of paper on a revolving drum, and the standard thermometer, a very carefully manufactured thermometer, with all its errors determined and tabulated. The other thermometers were all checked from this one. On top of the screen a Robinson's anemometer was screwed. This consisted of an upright rod, to the top of which were pivoted 4 arms free to revolve in a plane at right angles to it. At the end of these arms hemispherical cups were screwed. These were caught by the wind, and the arms revolved at a speed varying with the force of the wind. The speed of the wind could be read off on a dial below the arms. In addition there was an instrument called a Dines anemometer, which supplied interesting tracings of the force, duration, and direction of the wind. There was an added advantage in the fact that the drum on which these results were recorded was comfortably housed down below, so that one could sit in a comparatively warm room and follow all the varying phases of the blizzard which was raging without. The barometer used was of the Q standard pattern. When the ship was crushed, all the monthly records were saved, but the detailed tracings, which had been packed up in the hold, were lost. Though interesting, they were not really essential. Continuous observations were made during the long drift on the floe, and while on Elephant Island the temperature was taken at midday each day, as long as the thermometers lasted. The mortality amongst these instruments, especially those which were tied to string and swung round, was very high. A few extracts from the observations taken during 1915, the series for that year being practically complete, may be of interest. January was dull and overcast, only 7% of the observations recording a clear blue sky, 71% being completely overcast. The percentage of clear sky increased steadily up till June and July, these months showing respectively 42% and 45.7%. In August, 40% of the observations were clear sky, while September showed a sudden drop to 27%. October weather was much the same, and November was practically overcast the whole time, clear sky showing at only 8% of the observations. In December, the sky was completely overcast for nearly 90% of the time. Temperatures on the whole were fairly high, though a sudden unexpected drop in February after a series of heavy northeasterly gales caused the ship to be frozen in, and eventually put an end to any hopes of landing that year. The lowest temperature experienced was in July, when -35 Fahrenheit, i.e., 67 degrees below freezing, was reached. Fortunately, as the sea was one mass of consolidated pack, the air was dry, and many days of fine bright sunshine occurred. Later on, as the pack drifted northwards and broke up, wide lanes of water were formed, causing fogs and mist and dull overcast weather generally. In short, it may be said that in the Weddell Sea the best weather comes in winter. Unfortunately, during that season the sun also disappears, so that one cannot enjoy it as much as one would like. As a rule, too, southerly winds brought fine clear weather, with marked fall in the temperature, and those from the north were accompanied by mist, fog, and overcast skies, with comparatively high temperatures. In the Antarctic, a temperature of 30 degrees, i.e., 2 degrees below freezing, is considered unbearably hot. The greatest difficulty that was experienced was due to the accumulation of rime on the instruments. In low temperatures everything became covered with ice crystals, deposited from the air, which eventually grew into huge blocks. Sometimes these blocks became dislodged and fell, making it dangerous to walk along the decks. The rime collected on the thermometers, the glass bowl of the sunshine recorder, and the bearings of the anemometer, necessitating the frequent use of a brush to remove it, and sometimes effectively preventing the instruments from recording at all. One of our worst blizzards occurred on August 1, 1915, which was, for the ship, the beginning of the end. It lasted for 4 days, with cloudy and overcast weather for the 3 following days, and from that time onwards we enjoyed very little sun. The weather we experienced on Elephant Island can only be described as appalling. Situated as we were at the mouth of a gully down which a huge glacier was slowly moving, with the open sea in front and to the left, and towering, snow-covered mountains on our right, the air was hardly ever free from snowdrift, and the winds increased to terrific violence through being forced over the glacier and through the narrow gully. Huge blocks of ice were hurled about like pebbles, and cases of clothing and cooking utensils were whisked out of our hands and carried away to sea. For the first fortnight after our landing there, the gale blew at times at over 100 miles an hour. Fortunately, it never again quite reached that intensity, but on several occasions violent squalls made us very fearful for the safety of our hut. The island was almost continuously covered with a pall of fog and snow, clear weather obtaining occasionally when pack ice surrounded us. Fortunately, a series of southwesterly gales had blown all the ice away to the northeast 2 days before the rescue ship arrived, leaving a comparatively clear sea for her to approach the island. Being one solitary moving station in the vast expanse of the Weddell Sea, with no knowledge of what was happening anywhere around us, forecasting was very difficult and at times impossible. Great assistance in this direction was afforded by copies of Mr. R.C. Mossman's researches and papers on Antarctic meteorology, which he kindly supplied to us. I have tried to make this very brief account of the meteorological side of the expedition rather more popular than scientific, since the publication and scientific discussion of the observations will be carried out elsewhere. But if, while showing the difficulties under which we had to work, it emphasizes the value of Antarctic expeditions from a purely utilitarian point of view, and the need for further continuous research into the conditions obtaining in the immediate neighborhood of the pole, it will have achieved its object. Physics by R. W. James, M.A. Cantab, Bachelor of Science, London, Captain, R.E. Owing to the continued drift of the ship with the ice, the program of physical observations originally made out had to be considerably modified. It had been intended to set up recording magnetic instruments at the base, and to take a continuous series of records throughout the whole period of residence there, absolute measurements of the Earth's horizontal magnetic force, of the dip and declination being taken at frequent intervals for purposes of calibration. With the ice continually drifting, and the possibility of the floe cracking at any time, it proved impracticable to set up the recording instruments, and the magnetic observations were confined to a series of absolute measurements taken whenever opportunity occurred. These measurements, owing to the drift of the ship, extend over a considerable distance, and give a chain of values along a line stretching roughly from 77 degrees south latitude to 69 degrees south latitude. This is not the place to give the actual results. It is quite enough to state that, as might have been expected from the position of the magnetic pole, the values obtained correspond to a comparatively low magnetic latitude, the value of the dip ranging from 63 degrees to 68 degrees. So far as possible, continuous records of the electric potential gradient in the atmosphere were taken, a form of quadrant electrometer with a boom and ink recorder made by the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company being employed. Here again the somewhat peculiar conditions made work difficult, as the instrument was susceptible to small changes of level, such as occurred from time to time owing to the pressure of the ice on the ship. An ionium collector, for which the radioactive material was kindly supplied by Mr. F. H. Glue, was used. The chief difficulty to contend with was the constant formation of thick deposits of rime, which either grew over the insulation and spoiled it, or covered up the collector so that it could no longer act. Nevertheless, a considerable number of good records were obtained, which have not yet been properly worked out. Conditions during the expedition were very favorable for observations on the physical properties and natural history of sea ice, and a considerable number of results were obtained, which are, however, discussed elsewhere, mention of them being made here since they really come under the heading of physics. In addition to these main lines of work, many observations of a miscellaneous character were made, including those on the occurrence and nature of parhelia or mock suns, which were very common, and generally finely developed, and observations of the auroral displays, which were few and rather poor, owing to the comparatively low magnetic latitude. Since most of the observations made are of little value without a knowledge of the place where they were made, and since a very complete set of soundings were also taken, the daily determination of the ship's position was a matter of some importance. The drift of the ship throws considerable light on at least one geographical problem, that of the existence of Morel Land. The remainder of this appendix will therefore be devoted to a discussion of the methods used to determine the positions of the ship from day to day. The latitude and longitude were determined astronomically every day when the sun or stars were visible, the position thus determined serving as the fixed points between which the position on days when the sky was overcast could be interpolated by the process known as dead reckoning, that is to say, by estimating the speed and course of the ship, taking into account the various causes affecting it. The sky was often overcast for several days at a stretch, and it was worthwhile to take a certain amount of care in the matter. Captain Worsley constructed an apparatus which gave a good idea of the direction of drift at any time. This consisted of an iron rod, which passed through an iron tube, frozen vertically into the ice, into the water below. At the lower end of the rod in the water was a vane. The rod being free to turn, the vane took up the direction of the current, the direction being shown by an indicator attached to the top of the rod. The direction shown depended, of course, on the drift of the ice relative to the water, and did not take into account any actual current which may have been carrying the ice with it, but the true current seems never to have been large, and the direction of the vane probably gave fairly accurately the direction of the drift of the ice. No exact idea of the rate of drift could be obtained from the apparatus, although one could get an estimate of it by displacing the vane from its position of rest and noticing how quickly it returned to it, the speed of return being greater the more rapid the drift. Another means of estimating the speed and direction of the drift was from the trend of the wire when a sounding was being taken. The rate and direction of drift appear to depend almost entirely on the wind velocity and direction at the time. If any true current effect existed, it is not obvious from a rough comparison of the drift with the prevailing wind, but a closer investigation of the figures may show some outstanding effect due to current. The drift was always to the left of the actual wind direction. This effect is due to the rotation of the earth, a corresponding deviation to the right of the wind direction being noted by Nansen during the drift of the Fram. A change in the direction of the wind was often preceded by some hours by a change in the reading of the drift vane. This is no doubt due to the ice to windward being set in motion, the resulting disturbance traveling through the ice more rapidly than the approaching wind. For the astronomical observations, either the sextant or a theodolite was used. The theodolite employed was a light 3-inch vernier instrument by Carey Porter intended for sledging work. This instrument was fairly satisfactory, although possibly rigidity had been sacrificed to lightness to rather too great an extent. Another point which appears worth mentioning is the following. The foot screws were of brass. The tribrach into which they fitted was made of aluminum for the sake of lightness. The two metals have a different coefficient of expansion, and while the feet fitted the tribrach at ordinary temperatures, they were quite loose at temperatures in the region of 20 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. In any instrument designed for use at low temperatures, care should be taken that parts which have to fit together are made of the same material. For determining the position in drifting pack ice, the theodolite proved to be a more generally useful instrument than the sextant. The ice floes are quite steady in really thick pack ice, and the theodolite can be set up and leveled as well as on dry land. The observations, both for latitude and longitude, consist in measuring altitude of the sun or of a star. The chief uncertainty in this measurement is that introduced by the refraction of light by the air. At very low temperatures, the correction to be applied on this account is uncertain, and if possible, observations should always be made in pairs with a north star and a south star for a latitude, and an east star and a west star for a longitude. The refraction error will then usually mean out. This error affects observations both with the theodolite and the sextant, but in the case of the sextant, another cause of error occurs. In using the sextant, the angle between the heavenly body and the visible horizon is measured directly. Even in dense pack ice, if the observations are taken from the deck of the ship, or from a hummock or a low berg, the apparent horizon is usually sharp enough for the purpose. In very cold weather, however, and particularly if there are open leads and pools between the observer and the horizon, there is frequently a great deal of mirage, and the visible horizon may be miraged up several minutes. This will reduce the altitude observed, and corrections on this account are practically impossible to apply. This error may be counterbalanced to some extent by pairing observations as described above, but it by no means follows that the mirage effect will be the same in the two directions. Then again, during the summer months, no stars will be visible, and observations for latitude will have to depend on a single noon sight of the sun. If the sun is visible at midnight, its altitude will be too low for accurate observations, and in any case, atmospheric conditions will be quite different from those prevailing at noon. In the Antarctic, therefore, conditions are peculiarly difficult for getting really accurate observations, and it is necessary to reduce the probability of error in a single observation as much as possible. When possible, observations of the altitude of a star or of the sun should be taken with the theodolite, since the altitude is referred to the spirit level of the instrument and is independent of any apparent horizon. During the drift of the Endurance, both means of observation were generally employed. A comparison of the results showed an agreement between sextant and theodolite within the errors of the instrument if the temperature was above about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. At lower temperatures there were frequently discrepancies, which could generally be attributed to the mirage effects described above. As the Endurance was carried by the ice drift well to the west of the Weddell Sea, towards the position of the supposed Morel Land, the accurate determination of longitude became a matter of moment in view of the controversy as to the existence of this land. During a long voyage, latitude can always be determined with about the same accuracy, the accuracy merely depending on the closeness with which altitudes can be measured. In the case of longitude, matters are rather different. The usual method employed consists in the determination of the local time by astronomical observations, and the comparison of this time with Greenwich time, as shown by the ship's chronometer, an accurate knowledge of the errors and rate of the chronometer being required. During the voyage of the Endurance, about 15 months elapsed during which no check on the chronometers could be obtained by the observation of known land, and had no other check been applied, there would have been the probability of large errors in the longitudes. For the purpose of checking the chronometers, a number of observations of occultations were observed during the winter of 1915. An occultation is really the eclipse of a star by the moon. A number of such eclipses occur monthly, and are tabulated in the Nautical Almanac. From the data given there it is possible to compute the Greenwich time at which the phenomenon ought to occur for an observer situated at any place on the earth, provided his position is known within a few miles, which will always be the case. The time of disappearance of the star by the chronometer to be corrected is noted. The actual Greenwich time of the occurrence is calculated, and the error of the chronometer is thus determined. With ordinary care, the chronometer error can be determined in this way to within a few seconds, which is accurate enough for purposes of navigation. The principal difficulties of this method lie in the fact that comparatively few occultations occur, and those that do occur are usually of stars of the 5th magnitude or lower. In the Antarctic, conditions for observing occultation are rather favorable during the winter, since 5th magnitude stars can be seen with a small telescope at any time during the 24 hours if the sky is clear, and the moon is also often above the horizon for a large fraction of the time. In the summer, however, the method is quite impossible, since for some months stars are not to be seen. No chronometer check could be applied until June 1915. On June 24th, a series of 4 occultations were observed, and the results of the observations showed an error in longitude of a whole degree. In July, August, and September, further occultations were observed, and a fairly reliable rate was worked out for the chronometers and watches. After the crushing of the ship on October 27, 1915, no further occultations were observed, but the calculated rates for the watches were employed, and the longitude deduced using these rates on March 23, 1916, was only about 10 degrees of arc in error, judging by the observations of Joinville Land made on that day. It is thus fairly certain that no large error can have been made in the determination of the position of the Endurance at any time during the drift, and her course can be taken as known with greater certainty than is usually the case in a voyage of such length. End of Section 33, Part 1 of Appendix I of South. Appendix I, Part II of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 through 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Appendix I, Part II. South Atlantic Whales and Whaling, by Robert S. Clark, M.A., Bachelor of Science, Lieutenant R.N. V.R. Modern whaling methods were introduced into sub-Antarctic seas in 1904, and operations commenced in the following year at South Georgia. So successful was the initial venture that several companies were floated, and the fishing area was extended to the South Shetlands, the South Orkneys, and as far as 67 degrees south along the western coast of Graham Land. This area lies within the dependencies of the Falkland Islands and is under the control of the British government, and its geographical position offers exceptional opportunities for the successful prosecution of the industry by providing a sufficient number of safe anchorages and widely separated islands, where shore stations have been established. The dependencies of the Falkland Islands lie roughly within latitude 50 degrees and 65 degrees south and longitude 25 degrees and 70 degrees west, and include the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, South Sandwich, South Orkney, and South Shetland Islands, and part of Graham Land. The industry is prosperous, and the products always find a ready market. In this sub-Antarctic area alone, the resulting products more than doubled the world's supply. The total value of the Falkland Island dependencies in 1913 amounted to pounds 1,252,432. In 1914 to pounds 1,300,978. In 1915 to pounds 1,333,401, and in 1916 to pounds 1,774,570. This has resulted chiefly from the marketing of whale oil and the byproduct, guano, and represents for each total a season's capture of several thousand whales. In 1916, the number of whales captured in this area was 11,860, which included 6,000 for South Georgia alone. Whale oil, which is now the product of most economic value in the whaling industry, is produced in 4 grades, some companies adding a 5th. These are numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which in 1913 sold at pounds 24, pounds 22, pounds 20, and pounds 18 respectively per ton, net weight, barrels included. There are 6 barrels to a ton. The 1919 prices have increased to pounds 72, 10 shillings, pounds 68, pounds 65, and pounds 63 per ton, barrels included, less 2.5%. Whale oil can be readily transformed into glycerin. It is used in the manufacture of soap, and quite recently, both in this country and in Norway, it has been refined by means of a simple hardening process into a highly palatable and nutritious margarine. Wartime conditions emphasized the importance of the whale oil, and fortunately the supply was fairly constant for the production of the enormous quantities of glycerin required by the country in the manufacture of explosives. In relation to the food supply, it was no less important in saving the country from a fat famine when the country was confronted with the shortage of vegetable and other animal oils. The production of guano, bone meal, and flesh meal may pay off the running expenses of a whaling station, but their value lies, perhaps, more in their individual properties. Flesh meal makes up into cattle cake, which forms an excellent fattening food for cattle, while bone meal and guano are very effective fertilizers. Guano is the meat, generally the residue of distillation, which goes through a process of drying and disintegration, and is mixed with the crushed bone in the proportion of 2 parts flesh to 1 part bone. This is done chiefly at the shore stations, and to a less extent on floating factories, though so far on the latter it has not proved very profitable. Whale flesh, though slightly greasy perhaps and of strong flavor, is quite palatable, and at South Georgia it made a welcome addition to our bill of fare, the flesh of the humpback being used. A large supply of whale flesh was shipped as food for the dogs on the journey south, and this was eaten ravenously. It is interesting to note also the successful rearing of pigs at South Georgia, chiefly, if not entirely, on the whale products. The whale bone or baleen plates, which at one time formed the most valuable article of the Arctic fishery, may here be regarded as of secondary importance. The baleen plates of the southern right whale reach only a length of about 7 feet, and have been valued at £750 per ton, but the number of these whales captured is very small indeed. In the case of the other whalebone whales, the baleen plates are much smaller and of inferior quality, the baleen of the sei whale probably excepted, and this only makes about £85 per ton. Sperm whales have been taken at South Georgia and South Shetlands, but never in any quantity, being more numerous in warmer areas. The products and their value are too well known to be repeated. The Endurance reached South Georgia on November 5, 1914, and anchored in King Edward Cove, Cumberland Bay, off Grytviken, the shore station of the Argentina Pesca Company. During the month's stay at the island, a considerable amount of time was devoted to the study of the whales and the whaling industry, in the intervals of the general routine of expedition work, and simultaneously with other studies on the general life of this interesting sub-Antarctic island. Visits were made to 6 of the 7 existing stations. Observations were made on the whales landed, and useful insight was gathered as to the general working of the industry. From South Georgia, the track of the Endurance lay in a direct line to the South Sandwich Group, between Saunders and Candlemas Islands. Then southeasterly and southerly courses were steered to the Coates Land Barrier, along which we steamed for a few hundred miles until forced westward, when we were unfortunately held up in about latitude 76 degrees 34 minutes south and longitude 37 degrees 30 minutes west on January 19, 1915, by enormous masses of heavy pack ice. The ship drifted to latitude 76 degrees 59 minutes south, longitude 37 degrees 47 minutes west on March 19, 1915, and then west and north until crushed in latitude 69 degrees 5 minutes south and longitude 51 degrees 30 minutes west on October 26, 1915. We continued drifting gradually north, afloat on ice floes, past Graham Land and Joinville Island, and finally took to the boats on April 9, 1916, and reached Elephant Island on April 15th. The Falkland Island dependencies were thus practically circumnavigated, and it may be interesting to compare the records of whales seen in the region outside and to the south of this area with the records and the percentage of each species captured in the intensive fishing area. The most productive part of the South Atlantic lies south of latitude 50 degrees south, where active operations extend to and even beyond the Antarctic Circle. It appears to be the general rule in Antarctic waters that whales are more numerous the closer the association with ice conditions, and there seems to be reasonable grounds for supposing that this may explain the comparatively few whales sighted by expeditions which have explored the more northerly and more open seas, while the whalers themselves have even asserted that their poor seasons have nearly always coincided with the absence of ice, or with poor ice conditions. At all events, those expeditions which have penetrated far south and well into the pack ice have, without exception, reported the presence of whales in large numbers, even in the farthest south latitudes, so that our knowledge of the occurrence of whales in the Antarctic has been largely derived from these expeditions, whose main object was either the discovery of new land or the pole itself. The largest number of Antarctic expeditions has concentrated on the 2 areas of the South Atlantic and the Ross Sea, and the records of the occurrence of whales have, in consequence, been concentrated in these 2 localities. In the intervening areas, however, expeditions, notably the Belgica on the western side and the Gauss on the eastern side of the Antarctic continent, have reported whales in moderately large numbers, so that the stock is by no means confined to the 2 areas above mentioned. The effective fishing area may be assumed to lie within a radius of 100 miles from each shore station and a floating factory anchorage, and a rough estimate of all the Falkland stations works out at 160,000 square miles. The total for the whole Falkland area is about 2 million square miles, which is roughly less than a sixth of the total Antarctic sea area. The question then arises as to how far the catch percentage during the short fishing season affects the total stock, but so far one can only conjecture as to the actual results from a comparison of the numbers seen, chiefly by scientific and other expeditions, in areas outside the intensive fishing area with the numbers and percentage of each species captured in the intensive fishing area. Sufficient evidence, however, seems to point quite definitely to one species, the humpback, being in danger of extermination, but the blue and fin whales, the other two species of rorquals which form the bulk of the captures, appear to be as frequent now as they have ever been. The whales captured at the various whaling stations of the Falkland area are confined largely to three species: blue whale, Balaenoptera musculus, fin whale, Balaenoptera physalis, and humpback, Megaptera nodosa, sperm whales, Biceter catodon, and right whales, Balena glacius, being only occasional and rare captures, while the sei whale, Balaenoptera borealis, appeared in the captures at South Georgia in 1913 and now forms a large percentage of the captures at the Falkland Islands. During the earlier years of whaling at South Georgia and up to the fishing season 1910 through 1911, humpbacks formed practically the total catch. In 1912 through 1913, the following were the percentages for the three rorquals in the captures at South Georgia and South Shetlands. Humpback 38%, fin whale 36%, blue whale 20%. Of late years the percentages have altered considerably, blue whales and fin whales predominating, humpbacks decreasing rapidly. In 1915, the South Georgia Whaling Company, Messrs. Salvesen Lythe, captured 1,085 whales, consisting of 15% humpback, 25% fin whales, 58% blue whales, and 2 right whales. In the same year, the captures of 3 companies at the South Shetlands gave 1,512 whales, and the percentages worked out at 12% humpbacks, 42% fin whales, and 45% blue whales. In 1919, the Southern Whaling and Sealing Company captured, at Stromness, South Georgia, 529 whales, of which 2% were humpbacks, 51% fin whales, and 45% blue whales. These captures do not represent the total catch, but are sufficiently reliable to show how the species are affected. The reduction in numbers of the humpback is very noticeable, and even allowing for the possible increase in size of gear for the capture of the larger and more lucrative blue and fin whales, there is sufficient evidence to warrant the fears that the humpback stock is threatened with extinction. In the immediate northern areas, in the region from latitude 50 degrees south northward to the equator, which is regarded as next in importance quantitatively to the sub-Antarctic, though nothing like being so productive, the captures are useful for a comparative study and distribution. At Saldanha Bay, Cape Colony, in 1912, 131 whales were captured, and the percentages were as follows: 35% humpback, 13% fin whale, 4% blue whale, 46% sei whale, while nearer the equator at Port Alexander, the total capture was 322 whales, and the percentages gave 98% humpback and only 2 captures each of fin and sei whales. In 1914 at South Africa, chiefly Saldanha Bay and Durban, out of a total of 839 whales, 60% were humpback, 25% fin whales, and 13% blue whales. In 1916, out of a total of 853 whales, 10% were humpback, 13% fin whales, 6% blue whales, 68% sperm whales, and 1% sei whales. In Chilean waters in 1916, a total of 327 whales gave 31% humpbacks, 24% fin whales, 26% blue whales, 12% sperm whales, and 5 right whales. There seems then to be a definite interrelation between the two areas. The same species of whales are captured, and the periods of capture alternate with perfect regularity, the fishing season occurring from the end of November to April in the sub-Antarctic and from May to November in the subtropics. A few of the companies, however, carry on operations to a limited extent at South Georgia and at the Falkland Islands during the southern winter, but the fishing is by no means a profitable undertaking, though proving the presence of whales in this area during the winter months. The migrations of whales are influenced by two causes: the distribution of their food supply and the position of their breeding grounds. In the Antarctic during the summer months there is present in the sea an abundance of plant and animal life, and whales which feed on the small plankton organisms are correspondingly numerous, but in winter this state of things is reversed, and whales are poorly represented or absent, at least in the higher latitudes. During the drift of the Endurance, samples of plankton were taken almost daily during an Antarctic summer and winter. From December to March, a few minutes' haul of a tow net at the surface was sufficient to choke up the meshes with the plant and animal life, but this abundance of surface life broke off abruptly in April, and subsequent hauls contained very small organisms until the return of daylight and the opening up of the pack ice. The lower water strata, down to about 100 fathoms, were only a little more productive, and Euphausiae were taken in the hauls, though sparingly. During the winter spent at Elephant Island, our total catch of Gentoo penguins amounted to 1,436 for the period April 15th to August 30th, 1916. All these birds were cut up, the livers and hearts were extracted for food, and the skins were used as fuel. At the same time the stomachs were invariably examined, and a record kept of the contents. The largest proportion of these contained the small crustacean Euphausia, and this generally to the exclusion of all other forms. Occasionally, however, small fish were recorded. The quantity of Euphausia present in most of the stomachs was enormous for the size of the birds. These penguins were migrating, and came ashore only when the bays were clear of ice. As there were several periods of 14 consecutive days when the bays and the surrounding sea were covered over with a thick, compact mass of ice floes, and then penguins were entirely absent. Euphausia, then, seemed to be present in sufficient quantity in certain, if not in all, sub-Antarctic waters during the southern winter. We may assume, then, that the migration to the south during the Antarctic summer is definitely in search of food. Observations have proved the existence of a northern migration, and it seems highly improbable that this should also be in search of food, but rather for breeding purposes, and it seems that the whales select the more temperate regions for the bringing forth of their young. This view is strengthened by the statistical fetal records, which shows the pairing takes place in the northern areas, that the fetus is carried by the mother during the southern migration to the Antarctic, and that the calves are born in the more congenial waters north of the sub-Antarctic area. We have still to prove, however, the possibility of a circumpolar migration, and we are quite in the dark as to the number of whales that remain in sub-Antarctic areas during the southern winter. The following is a rough classification of whales, with special reference to those known to occur in the South Atlantic. 1. Whalebone whales. Mysticoceti. Right whales, Balenidae, which includes the southern right whale, Balena glacius, and rorquals, Balaenopteridae, which includes finner whales, Balaenoptera, and humpback whales, Megaptera nodosa. Further subclassifications of finner whales include the blue whale, B. musculus, the fin whale, B. physalis, the sei whale, B. borealis, the piked whale, B. acuterostrata, and bride's whale, B. bridii. 2. Toothed whales, Odontoceti. Sperm whale, Physeter catodon, beaked whales, including the bottlenose whales, Hyperudin rostratus, and dolphins, which include the killer, Orcinus orca, blackfish, Globocephalus mellis, and porpoises, Langanorhynchus species. The subdivision of whalebone whales is one of degree in the size of the whalebone. These whales have enormously muscular tongues, which press the water through the whalebone lamellae, and thus by a filtering process retain the small food organisms. The food of the whalebone whales is largely the small crustacea which occur in the plankton, though some whales, humpback, fin whales, and sei whales, feed also on fish. The stomachs examined at South Georgia during December 1914 belonged to the three species, humpbacks, fin whales, and blue whales, and all contained a small crustacea, Euphausia, with a mixture of amphipods. The toothed whales, sperms, and bottlenoses are known to live on squids, and that there is an abundance of this type of food in the Weddell Sea was proved by an examination of penguin and seal stomachs. Emperor penguins, and hundreds of these were examined, were invariably found to contain cephalopod beaks, while large, partly digested squids were often observed in Weddell seals. A dorsal fin is present in the rorquals, but absent in right whales. With other characters, notably the size of the animal, it serves as a ready mark of identification, but is occasionally confusing owing to the variation in shape in some of the species. With the exception of several schools of porpoises, very few whales were seen during the outward voyage. Not till we approached the Falkland area did they appear in any numbers. 4 small schools of fin whales and a few humpbacks were sighted on October 28th and 29th, 1914, in latitude 38 degrees 1 minute south, longitude 55 degrees 3 minutes west, and in latitude 40 degrees 35 minutes south, longitude 53 degrees 11 minutes west, while Globicephalus mellis was seen only once, in latitude 45 degrees 17 minutes south, longitude 48 degrees 58 minutes west, on October 31st, 1914. At South Georgia, the whales captured at the various stations in December 1914 were blue whales, fin whales, and humpbacks, arranged respectively according to numbers captured. During the fishing season 1914 through 1915, from December to March, in the area covered, South Georgia to the South Sandwich Islands and along Coates Land to the head of the Weddell Sea, the records of whales were by no means numerous. 2 records only could with certainty be assigned to the humpback, and these were in the neighborhood of the South Sandwich Islands. Pack ice was entered in latitude 59 degrees 55 minutes south, longitude 18 degrees 28 minutes west, and blue whales were recorded daily until about 65 degrees south. Between latitude 65 degrees 43 minutes south, longitude 17 degrees 30 minutes west, on December 27, 1914, and latitude 69 degrees 59 minutes south, longitude 17 degrees 31 minutes west, on January 3, 1915, no whales were seen. On January 4th, however, in latitude 69 degrees 59 minutes south, longitude 17 degrees 36 minutes west, 2 large sperm whales appeared close ahead of the ship in fairly open water, and were making westward. They remained sufficiently long on the surface to render their identification easy. Farther south, blue whales were only seen occasionally, and fin whales could only be identified in 1 or 2 cases. Killers, however, were numerous, and the lesser piked whale was quite frequent. There was no doubt about the identity of this latter species, as it often came close alongside the ship. From April to September inclusive, the sea was frozen over, with the exception of local leads, and whales were found to be absent. In October, whales again made their appearance, and from then onwards they were a daily occurrence. Identification of the species, however, was a difficult matter, for the Endurance was crushed and had sunk, and observations were only possible from the ice floe, or later on from the boats. The high vertical spout, opening out into a dense spray, was often visible, and denoted the presence of blue and fin whales. The lesser piked whale again appeared in the leads close to our camp floe and was easily identified. An exceptional opportunity was presented to us on December 6, 1915, when a school of 8 bottlenose whales, Hyperoodon rostratus, appeared in a small pool alongside Ocean Camp in latitude 67 degrees 47 minutes south, longitude 52 degrees 18 minutes west. These ranged from about 20 feet to a little over 30 feet in length, and were of a uniform dark dun color, the large specimens having a dull yellow appearance. There were no white spots. At the edge of the pack ice during the first half of April 1916, about latitude 62 degrees south and longitude 54 degrees west, entrance to Bransfield Strait, whales were exceedingly numerous, and these were chiefly fin whales, though a few seemed to be sei whales. It is interesting to note that the fishing season 1915 through 1916 was exceptionally productive, no less than 11,860 whales having been captured in the Falkland area alone. The South Atlantic whaling industry, then, has reached a critical stage in development. It is now dependent on the captures of the large fin and blue whales, humpbacks having been rapidly reduced in numbers, so that the total stock appears to have been affected. With regard to the other species, the southern right whale has never been abundant in the captures. The sperm whale and the sei whale have shown a good deal of seasonal variation, though never numerous, and the bottlenose and lesser piked whale have so far not been hunted, except in the case of the latter for human food. The vigorous slaughter of whales, both in the sub-Antarctic and in the subtropics, for the one area reacts on the other, calls for universal legislation to protect the whales from early commercial extinction, and the industry, which is of worldwide economic importance, from having to be abandoned. The British government, with the control of the world's best fisheries, is thoroughly alive to the situation, and an interdepartmental committee, under the direction of the Colonial Office, is at present devising a workable scheme for suitable legislation for the protection of the whales and for the welfare of the industry. End of Part 2 of Appendix I of South.
Appendix II of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Appendix II, the expedition huts at McMurdo Sound, by Sir E. H. Shackleton. The following notes are designed for the benefit of future explorers who may make McMurdo Sound a base for inland operations, and to clear any inaccuracies or ambiguities concerning the history, occupation, and state of these huts. 1. The National Antarctic Expedition's hut at Hut Point, the head of McMurdo Sound. This hut was constructed by Captain Scott in 1902, by the expeditions sent out by the Royal Geographical Society, the Royal Society, the Government, and by private subscription. Captain Robert F. Scott was appointed to the command of the expedition. I served as third lieutenant until February 1903, when I was invalided home through a broken blood vessel in the lungs, the direct result of scurvy contracted on the southern journey. The Discovery hut was a large, strong building, but was so draughty and cold in comparison with the ship, which was moored 100 yards away, that it was, during the first year, never used for living quarters. Its sole use was as a storehouse, and a large supply of rough stores, such as flour, cocoa, coffee, biscuit, and tinned meat, was left there in the event of its being used as a place of retreat, should any disaster overtake the ship. During the second year occasional parties camped inside the hut, but no bunks or permanent sleeping quarters were ever erected. The discomfort of the hut was a byword on the expedition, but it formed an excellent depot and starting point for all parties proceeding to the south. When the Discovery finally left McMurdo Sound, the hut was stripped of all gear, including the stove, but there was left behind a large depot of the stores mentioned above. I was not aware of this until I returned to McMurdo Sound in February 1908, when I sent Adams, Joyce, and Wild across to the hut whilst the Nimrod was lying off the ice. On the return of the party, they reported that the door had been burst open, evidently by a southerly blizzard, and was jammed by snow outside and in, so they made an entrance through one of the lee windows. They found the hut practically clear of snow, and the structure quite intact. I used the hut in the spring, i.e., September and October 1908, as a storehouse for the large amount of equipment, food, and oil that we were to take on the southern journey. We built a sort of living room out of the cases of provisions, and swept out the debris. The southern party elected to sleep there before the start, but the supporting party slept outside in the tents, as they considered it warmer. We still continued to use the lee window as means of ingress and egress, to avoid continual shoveling away of the snow, which would be necessary, as every southerly blizzard blocked up the main entrance. The various depot parties made use of the hut for replenishing their stores, which had been sledged from my own hut to Hut Point. On the night of March 3, 1909, I arrived with the southern party, with a sick man, having been absent on the march 128 days. Our position was bad, as the ship was north of us. We tried to burn the magnetic hut in the hope of attracting attention from the ship, but we were not able to get it to light. We finally managed to light a flare of carbide, and the ship came down to us in a blizzard, and all were safely aboard at 1 a.m. on March 4, 1909. Before leaving the hut we jammed the window up with baulks of timber, to the best of our ability, in the storm and the darkness. The hut was used again by the Ross Sea section of this last expedition. The snow was cleared out, and extra stores were placed in it. From reports I have received, the Discovery hut was in as good condition in 1917 as it was in 1902. The stores placed there in 1902 are intact. There are a few cases of extra provisions and oil in the hut, but no sleeping gear or accommodation, nor stoves, and it must not be looked upon as anything else than a shelter and a most useful pied-à-terre for the start of any southern journey. No stores nor any equipment have been taken from it during either of my two expeditions. 2. Cape Royds Hut. For several reasons, when I went into McMurdo Sound in 1908 in command of my own expedition, known as the British Antarctic Expedition, after having failed to land on King Edward VII Land, I decided to build our hut at Cape Royds, a small promontory 23 miles north of Hut Point. Here the whole shore party lived in comfort through the winter of 1908. When spring came, stores were sledged to Hut Point, so that should the sea ice break up early between these two places, we might not be left in an awkward position. After the return of the southern party, we went direct north to civilization, so I never visited my hut again. I had left, however, full instructions with Professor David as to the care of the hut, and before the whole expedition left, the hut was put in order. A letter was pinned in a conspicuous place inside, stating that there were sufficient provisions and equipment to last 15 men for 1 year, indicating also the details of these provisions and the position of the coal store. The stove was in good condition, and the letter ended with an invitation for any succeeding party to make what use they required of stores and hut. The hut was then locked, and the key nailed on the door in a conspicuous place. From the report of Captain Scott's last expedition, the hut was in good condition, and from a still later report from the Ross Sea side of this present expedition, the hut was still intact. 3. Cape Evans Hut. This large and commodious hut was constructed by Captain Scott at Cape Evans on his last expedition. The party lived in it in comfort, and it was left well supplied with stores in the way of food and oil, and a certain amount of coal. Several of the scientific staff of this present expedition were ashore in it, when the Aurora, which was to have been the permanent winter quarters, broke adrift in May 1915 and went north with the ice. The hut became the permanent living quarters for the 10 marooned men, and thanks to the stores they were able to sustain life in comparative comfort, supplementing these stores from my hut at Cape Royds. In January 1917, after I had rescued the survivors, I had the hut put in order and locked up. To sum up, there are 3 available huts in McMurdo Sound. A. The Discovery hut, with a certain amount of rough stores, and only of use as a point of departure for the south. B. Cape Royds hut, with a large amount of general stores, but no clothing or equipment now. C. Cape Evans hut, with a large amount of stores, but no clothing or equipment, and only a few sledges. 4. Depots south of Hut Point. In spite of the fact that several depots have been laid to the south of Hut Point on the Barrier, the last being at the Gap, the entrance to the Beardmore Glacier, no future expedition should depend on them, as the heavy snowfall obliterates them completely. There is no record of the depots of any expedition being made use of by any subsequent expedition. No party in any of my expeditions has used any depot laid down by a previous expedition. End of Appendix II.
Main results of the British Antarctic expedition of 1907 under my command are as follows. We reached a point within 97 geographical miles of the South Pole. The only thing that stopped us from reaching the actual point was the lack of 50 pounds of food. Another party reached for the first time the South Magnetic Pole. Another party reached the summit of a great active volcano, Mount Erebus. We made many interesting geological and scientific discoveries and had many narrow escapes throughout the whole time. A typical narrow escape was when we were going up the Great Glacier towards the pole. We were marching along, three of us harnessed to one sledge in very bad light. Our last pony was being led by another man with 500 pounds of stores. All of a sudden, we heard a shout of help from the man behind. We looked round and saw him supporting himself by his elbows on the edge of a chasm. There was no sign of the pony, and the sledge was jammed with its bow in the crevasse. We rushed back and helped the man out, and then hauled the sledge out. Then we lay down to have a look, but nothing but a black gulf lay below. The pony may have fallen 1,000 or 1,500 feet. Anyhow, he'd gone. What has happened was this. We, the first three, with our weight distributed, crossed in safety in the bad light the bridge over an unseen chasm. The weight of the pony following was too much. It crashed through, but the swingle tree of the sledge snapped, and that saved the sledge. The man leading the pony said that he just felt a rushing sort of wind. The rope was torn out of his hand. He flung himself forward and thus escaped. After this, we four men had 1,000 pounds to pull, and we were unable to pull the whole load at once, so we had to relay. That is, we hauled half our load for a mile, then we walked back a mile, and then we hauled the other half up. So for every mile we gained to the south, we had to cover 3 to do it. And slowly we arose up the largest and the longest glacier in the world, some days spending 12 hours doing 3 miles, other times spending nearly half the day hauling each sledge up by means of the alpine rope. And thus we went along, and thus we returned, having done a work that has resulted in great advantage to science, and for the first time returning without the loss of a single human life. And throughout all this, I was helped by a party of men who were regardless of themselves and only thinking of the good of the expedition. I, Ernest Shackleton, have today, March the 30th, dictated this record.